Sergeant Ryan Mitchell slammed a bucket of dirty water at Captain Emily Carter's feet and laughed in front of the entire unit. Since headquarters sent us a paper pusher, she can start by scrubbing floors. He sneered, and the whole yard erupted in laughter while Emily said nothing at all. What none of them knew was that the quiet woman they had just humiliated was the most feared operator in Marine Corps history, and in less than 2 weeks, one veteran sergeant would freeze mid-sentence, grab his radio, and shout across the entire base, "Iron Wolf, stand by." Before we continue, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and stay with me all the way to the end of this story. And down in the comments, tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The transport truck rolled to a stop and the engine cut off with a low, tired groan. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the back gate dropped and a single figure stepped down into the dust. She carried one bag. She wore no rank insignia that anyone bothered to look for. She said nothing to the driver, nothing to the gate guard, nothing to the 2 Marines lounging near the equipment shed, who turned their heads just long enough to size her up and dismiss her. "That's her," Corporal Jake Dawson muttered, elbowing Sergeant Ryan Mitchell. "That's the new cadet from headquarters." Mitchell squinted. "That's not a cadet. Cadets don't get sent here. This is Fort Redstone. Nobody gets sent here unless somebody upstairs hates them. Maybe somebody upstairs hates her." Mitchell laughed low and dry. "Or she volunteered for the wrong reasons. Look at her. She's what, 28, 29, doesn't even carry herself like she's been in a fight in her life." Neither of them noticed the way her eyes moved as she walked, scanning roof lines, scanning exits, scanning the 2 of them without ever appearing to look at them directly. It was a habit so old, it no longer felt like a habit. It felt like breathing. She reached the check-in table and set her bag down without a sound. "Name," the duty clerk said, not looking up. "Carter. Emily Carter." "Rank," a pause. Not hesitation, calculation. "Captain." The clerk finally looked up, surprised, then shrugged it off as a clerical mistake he wasn't paid enough to question. He stamped a form and slid it across. "Barracks 4, you'll report to Sergeant Mitchell for in-processing." Mitchell overheard his own name and stepped forward, arms crossed, chin lifted. "That's me, so, Captain, huh?" He said the word like it tasted strange in his mouth. Funny, because captains usually show up with an escort. Captains usually show up expected. "I wasn't told I needed an escort," Emily said quietly. "No, I guess you weren't." Mitchell circled her, once slow the way a man circles something he thinks he already understands. "Let me guess. Personnel record review? Admin liaison? Maybe you're here to make sure we're filling out our paperwork correctly." "I'm here to train." Dawson snorted so hard he had to cover his mouth. "Train," Mitchell repeated. "Sweetheart, this isn't a training center. This is where they send Marines who already survived the training center and needed somewhere harder. You understand what I'm saying? Men die running these courses. Experienced men, grown men who've seen combat." "I understand." "Do you say her?" Emily didn't answer that. She simply looked at him, steady, unreadable, and something about the stillness of it made Mitchell's jaw tighten in a way he didn't like and couldn't explain. "Get her settled," he told Dawson, turning away first, which, though neither of them would ever admit, it was itself a small defeat. "And find her something to do, something that matches her experience level." Dawson grinned. "I've got just the thing." The equipment shed smelled like oil and old canvas. Dawson shoved a stiff, bristled brush into Emily's hands, along with a stack of mud-cake boots that belonged to half the platoon. "Since you're new," he said, "start by learning how things work around here." "Understood." He waited for her to argue. She didn't. He waited for her to sigh, to roll her eyes, to say something about how this wasn't in her job description. She simply sat down, picked up the first boot, and began cleaning it with the same quiet focus she might have given to disarming a bomb. That unsettled Dawson more than any protest could have. "You're not even going to complain." Would it change the outcome? He didn't have an answer for that, so he left. Outside word had already spread through the barracks. By evening, half the base had heard some version of the story, the new cadet who got handed a scrub brush on her first day and just quietly went to work. Some Marines laughed about it over dinner. A few felt a flicker of discomfort. They couldn't name the kind of feeling you get when a joke goes on a little too long and nobody knows how to stop it. One of them was Private First Class Tommy Reyes, barely 20 years old, still new enough to the core that he hadn't yet learned which instincts to trust and which to bury. He watched Emily through the open shed door as he crossed the yard boots in one hand, and something about the way she held herself made him pause. She wasn't slumped in defeat. She wasn't seething with resentment either. She sat with her spine straight, her movements economical, like every motion had been trained out of waste years ago. "You need help with those?" he asked, stepping inside before he'd fully decided to. Emily looked up. "I've got it." "You sure there's like 40 pairs there?" "I've counted worse." Reyes laughed, uncertain whether that was a joke. "Okay, well, I'm Reyes, Tommy Reyes." "Emily, they're saying you're some kind of admin cadet." "They're saying a lot of things." "Are any of them true?" Emily set down the boot in her hand and looked at him. Really looked the way she hadn't looked at Mitchell or Dawson because Reyes hadn't laughed at her, hadn't handed her something meant to humiliate. "Some people need to believe what makes them comfortable," she said. "It's easier than asking questions." Reyes frowned, chewing on that. "That's a weird way to answer a question." "Then I gave you the right answer." He left more confused than when he arrived, and somehow more curious than he had any reason to be. The days that followed fell into a pattern designed, whether anyone admitted it or not, to break her. She was assigned to carry water crates to the far end of the training range, a task normally split between 4 Marines, and she carried them alone trip after trip and without complaint, until Mitchell finally called it off, not because she'd struggled, but because the sight of her doing it without struggling had started drawing stares. She was assigned mess hall cleanup after every meal for a week straight. She was left off the roster for the morning physical training runs. "Wouldn't want her to fall behind and slow everyone down," Dawson said with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes, and instead was told to organize supply inventory in a stifling storage room, while the platoon ran 5 miles under the desert sun. Nobody saw what she did after hours. Nobody saw her wake at 4 in the morning before even the earliest risers and run the same 5 miles alone, faster than any man on that roster, before slipping back into the storage room to finish inventory exactly on schedule. Nobody saw her studying terrain maps by flashlight long after taps, memorizing elevation lines and wind corridors and dry riverbeds that could hide a column of men. Nobody saw the calluses on her hands that had nothing to do with scrub brushes. Except once someone almost did. It happened on the 6th night. Reyes had drawn the short straw for perimeter watch, a duty nobody wanted at 2 in the morning when the desert cold cut through every layer of clothing and the silence made every sound feel like a threat. He was pacing the fence line, half asleep on his feet, when he heard something. Not a loud sound, a wrong sound, a shift in the pattern of silence that his body reacted to before his brain understood why. He raised his rifle, heart hammering, and swept the darkness beyond the fence. Nothing. Then a voice, calm and low, from directly behind him. "There's a coyote den about 40 meters out southwest. Something's agitated it. It's not coming this way, but you'll want to log the activity." Reyes spun so fast he nearly fell. "Jesus, Carter. What are you? How did you get behind me?" Emily stood there in the dark, dressed for the cold, utterly calm, as if she hadn't just materialized without a sound out of open ground he'd been actively watching. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "You couldn't? You were behind the fence perimeter that's restricted after dark. How did you even—" "I walked." "You walked past the checkpoint, past me." "You were watching the wrong angle." Reyes stared at her, torn between reporting a violation and asking the question actually burning through his mind. "Who taught you to move it like that?" For just a moment, barely a flicker, something passed behind Emily's eyes. Not fear, something closer to old grief, quickly folded away and put back into whatever locked compartment it lived in. "A long time ago," she said, "somebody who isn't here anymore." "Carter, log the coyote activity, Reyes, and do me a favor." "What?" "Don't mention this to Sergeant Mitchell." "Why not?" She looked at him then, and for the first time since she'd arrived, there was something almost like a warning in her voice. Not threatening, protective. Because some things are easier to explain later than they are right now. She turned and walked back toward the barracks, and Reyes noticed, really noticed. The way you notice something once you've been shown it and can never unsee it, that her footsteps made no sound on the gravel at all. He didn't report her, but he didn't sleep again that night either. The next morning, Mitchell announced the week's evaluation exercises, and true to form, he assigned Emily to the observation post, the position reserved for personnel not expected to contribute meaningfully. You can watch from up there, he told her, gesturing to a low ridge overlooking the mock combat course. Take notes if you want. Feel free to critique our form. I'd rather participate. The words landed in the yard like a dropped weapon. A few Marines actually turned to look. Mitchell blinked, caught off guard by the flatness of her tone, no anger in it, no defiance. Just a simple statement of fact, the way someone might correct a typo. Excuse me. I said I'd rather participate. This isn't a request-based evaluation, Captain. He said the rank with just enough edge to make it an insult. This is a live-fire coordination drill. We use blanks, but the discipline required is real. Men have been hurt running this course when they weren't ready. I'm ready. Dawson laughed from somewhere behind him. Based on what? 2 weeks of scrubbing boots. Emily didn't look at Dawson. She kept her eyes on Mitchell. Based on the fact that you're 1 man short on Team 2 after Corporal Ellis pulled his hamstring yesterday, and you're about to run this drill with an uneven formation that's going to leave your flank exposed on the second checkpoint. Silence. Mitchell's jaw worked, but nothing came out immediately. Because she was right. Ellis had pulled his hamstring, and he hadn't announced the formation problem to anyone yet. He'd only just realized it himself 20 minutes ago while reviewing the roster. How do you know about Ellis? I read the medical log this morning while I was organizing supply inventory. It's my job to notice details, Sergeant. It's what I do. That log is restricted. It was left open on the clipboard by the aid station. I didn't go looking for it. I just don't forget things I see. Mitchell stared at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. Not respect, not yet, but the first faint crack in the certainty he'd been standing on since she stepped off that truck. Fine, he said finally, almost daring her to fail. You want in, you're in. Team 2, last position. If you slow them down, you're out for the rest of the rotation. Understood. As she walked toward the staging line, Dawson leaned toward Mitchell and muttered, You're actually letting her run it. She's not going to last 30 seconds, Mitchell said, but his voice didn't carry the same confidence it had an hour earlier. The drill began with a signal flare, and immediately everything Mitchell expected happened for about 4 minutes. Team 2 moved through the first checkpoint clumsily, Emily hanging back near the rear, exactly where a green, untested Marine belonged. She followed commands. She didn't push forward. She let the men ahead of her make the calls. Then the ambush trigger sprang early, a training malfunction not part of the planned scenario, and half the squad's blank fire charges detonated in the wrong sequence, filling the corridor with smoke and chaos and shouting voices that could no longer hear each other over the ringing in their ears. Fall back! Fall back! The fire team leader screamed, panic cracking his voice. No! Emily's voice cut through the smoke, sharp enough that 3 men froze out of pure instinct. Falling back puts you directly into the secondary trigger zone. Hold position and shift right now. Who put you in charge? There's no time to argue. Right flank. Now, move. Something in her voice, and not volume, but absolute certainty, made bodies move before minds caught up. The squad shifted right as a unit, and seconds later, the secondary smoke charge detonated exactly where they would have retreated into. For a moment, nobody spoke. They simply stood there in the drifting smoke, staring at the churned dirt where they would have been standing, understanding on some primal level that the quiet woman in the back had just kept every one of them from a training injury that could have ended a career. How did you know that was there? The fire team leader asked, breathless. Emily lowered her rifle. I studied the course layout last night. The course layout is classified until the morning of the drill. I studied the terrain contours instead. Same result, longer process. She said it simply, like it was obvious, like anyone in her position would have done the same, never mentioning that studying terrain contours from memory well enough to predict a hidden charge placement was a skill that took most operators years of specialized training to develop, if they developed it at all. From the ridge, Mitchell watched all of it happen through binoculars he'd raised almost as a formality, expecting to confirm what he already believed. His hands had gone very still. Dawson, he said slowly. Yeah. Did you see that? I saw it. That's not admin training. Dawson didn't answer right away. He was still watching the smoke clear, still watching Emily fall silently back into formation as if nothing unusual had happened at all, as if she hadn't just moved a squad of trained Marines with a single sentence. No, he finally said. It's really not. That evening, the mess hall buzzed with the story retold and exaggerated, with every telling though the exaggeration hardly seemed necessary. Reyes sat near the back, saying nothing, eating slowly, watching Emily eat alone at the far end of the table, exactly as she had every night since arriving invisible, by her own design, even now, even after what she'd done. Dawson approached her tray uninvited and sat down across from her, arms folded on the table. All right, he said, I'll bite. Who are you really? You already have my name. That's not what I'm asking. Emily set down her fork. What are you asking, Corporal? I'm asking why an admin cadet reads restricted medical logs by accident and predicts hidden ordnance placement by memorizing terrain contours for fun. I'm asking why you move like someone who's done this before, not training before, real before. The mess hall had gone quieter around them, conversation slowing, as ears tuned in without heads turning. Emily held his gaze for a long moment. Some records aren't meant to be read by everyone, Corporal Dawson. Not because they're secret, for no reason. Because some information puts people at risk just by existing where the wrong ears can hear it. That's not an answer. No, she agreed, it isn't. She rose, picked up her tray, and walked it to the return window. And Dawson sat there staring after her with the distinct, uncomfortable feeling of a man who had just asked a locked door a question and received in return only the sound of the lock turning tighter. 2 nights later, Master Sergeant Daniel Brooks arrived at Fort Redstone for a routine liaison rotation. A broad-shouldered veteran with 15 years of service and a reputation for saying little and noticing everything. He wasn't looking for anything unusual. He was tired from travel, focused on paperwork, thinking about nothing more complicated than a hot meal in a bunk. Then he crossed paths with Emily near the equipment lockers, and something in him went very still. It wasn't her face. He didn't recognize her face at all. It was the way she carried the equipment case in her left hand, angled slightly, weight distributed along the forearm instead of the wrist, a grip technique almost nobody used anymore because almost nobody had been trained by the handful of instructors who still taught it. He'd seen that exact grip once before, years ago, in a canyon half a world away, on a night he'd spent a long time trying not to think about. A night when an operator he never saw clearly and never learned the name of had kept his entire team alive against odds that should have buried them all. He knew that operator only by call sign. Brooks stood frozen in the doorway of the equipment shed, watching Emily set the case down with the same precise, economical motion, and felt something cold move through his chest that had nothing to do with the desert night air. "Excuse me," he said before he'd fully decided to speak. "Have we met?" Emily turned, and for just a fraction of a second, so brief that anyone less trained than Brooks would have missed it entirely, something flickered behind her eyes. Recognition, caution, the instant practiced calculation of someone deciding in real time exactly how much of the truth the moment could survive. "I don't believe so," she said evenly. "I'd remember." "Right," Brooks said slowly, not believing her for a second. "My mistake." He walked, but he didn't stop watching. And that night, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, he pulled an old, unofficial file from the bottom of his gear bag. A file with no name attached to it, only a single handwritten call sign scrawled across the front in his own younger handwriting. Iron Wolf. He stared at those 2 words for a long time before finally closing the file and lying back on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, running the numbers, running the timeline, running the grip technique over and over in his mind until sleep finally reluctantly took him. The following morning, Colonel Hayes gathered the base for an announcement that changed the shape of everything to come. "In 4 days," he said, his voice carrying flat and final across the assembled ranks, "we will be running a full-scale desert combat simulation. Live coordination, live movement, real terrain, minimal support. This is the hardest exercise this base runs, and it is run exactly once a year for a reason. I expect every squad leader to have their formations finalized by tomorrow morning." Mitchell's eyes drifted almost against his will to the back row where Emily stood at attention, silent as always. An idea took root in him, small at first, then growing with an ugliness he didn't examine too closely. "Sir," he said, stepping forward before he could stop himself, "request permission to place Captain Carter in a forward position for this exercise. Given her performance the other day, I think it's time we see what she's really made of." Colonel Hayes considered this, glancing toward Emily, who hadn't moved, hadn't reacted, hadn't given away a single flicker of what she was thinking. Forward position is a demanding assignment, Sergeant. I'm aware, sir. Captain Carter, Hayes said. Any objection? Every eye in the formation turned toward her. Emily let the silence stretch for exactly as long as it needed to. No objection, sir, she said quietly. Put me wherever you need me. Mitchell allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The smile of a man who believed he was finally about to prove something he'd been certain of since the moment a quiet woman stepped off a transport truck 2 weeks ago. He had no idea he was about to send the most dangerous operator in the United States Marine Corps directly into the one place where her true identity could no longer stay hidden. And somewhere in the back of the formation, Master Sergeant Daniel Brooks watched the exchange with his jaw set tight, the old file still burning a hole in his gear bag, already certain of something he wasn't ready to say out loud. 4 days. 4 days until the desert would demand to know exactly who Emily Carter really was and whether the name whispered in old unofficial files across half the world was about to walk back out into the light. The 4 days that followed were the longest of Sergeant Ryan Mitchell's career, though he would never have admitted that out loud, not even to himself. It started small, a tightening in his chest every time he passed the equipment shed, a habit of glancing toward the barracks whenever Emily's name came up in conversation, as if saying it too loudly might summon something he wasn't prepared to face. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself the coincidence with Ellis's hamstring was luck, that the smoke charge prediction was a fluke, that Master Sergeant Brooks was simply tired from travel and seeing ghosts where there weren't any. But late that first night, unable to sleep, Mitchell found himself standing outside the supply room where Emily had been assigned to finish inventory. Through the narrow window, he watched her work, not sorting boxes the way a bored clerk might, but moving with the same economical precision he'd seen on the training course. Fast, silent, deliberate. He knocked before he could stop himself. Emily looked up. Sergeant, can't sleep either. I don't sleep much. Neither do I lately. He stepped inside, arms crossed, trying to look more casual than he felt. Look, Carter, Captain, whatever you are, I want to ask you something and I want an honest answer. I'll give you what I can. That's not the same thing as honest. Emily set down the clipboard in her hands. No, she agreed, it isn't. Mitchell exhaled hard through his nose. Frustration and something like fear tangled together in his chest. 2 weeks ago, I handed you a bucket and told you to scrub floors. I made jokes about you in front of the whole platoon. I called you a paper pusher, and you just took it every single time. Why, would arguing have changed anything? Maybe. No, she said quietly. It wouldn't have. Men like you don't listen to words. You listen to results. So I gave you time and I let the results speak instead. The bluntness of it hit harder than an insult would have. Mitchell felt heat crawl up the back of his neck. That's a hell of a thing to say to a superior. I'm not trying to be cruel, Sergeant. I'm trying to be honest since you asked for it. She studied him for a moment and something in her expression softened, just slightly, not pity, but something closer to understanding. You're not a bad Marine. You run a tight platoon. You care about your men more than you let yourself show. That's why you didn't like me the moment I stepped off that truck, because you couldn't categorize me, and men like you need categories to know how to lead. Mitchell said nothing for a long moment, then quietly, you've done this before. Read people, I mean. Like it's second nature. It's kept me alive. Alive from what? Emily picked the clipboard back up, a clear signal that the conversation had reached its limit. Get some sleep, Sergeant. 4 days isn't much time to prepare a squad. He lingered in the doorway a moment longer, wanting to push further, knowing instinctively that pushing further would get him nowhere. Finally, he turned and left, and behind him, Emily set the clipboard down again and stared at the wall for a long time, her jaw tight, her eyes distant, carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent years being underestimated and had learned painfully that correcting people rarely accomplished anything except making herself a target. The second day brought a different kind of trouble. Private First Class Tommy Reyes couldn't stop thinking about the night on perimeter watch, the footsteps that made no sound, the voice that appeared behind him out of nowhere, the flicker of old grief in Emily's eyes when he'd asked who taught her to move like that. He wasn't naturally reckless, but curiosity had a way of overriding caution in 20-year-olds, and by mid-afternoon that curiosity had walked him straight into the base's small records office, where a bored corporal manned a terminal nobody paid much attention to. Hey, Reyes said, trying to sound casual. Random question. Is there any way to look up an officer's service history, like general assignment stuff? The corporal, a heavy-set man named Alvarez, didn't look up from his magazine. Depends on clearance level. Basic postings, sure. Anything classified, you're wasting your time. Half of it comes back redacted before you even finish typing the name. Can you try one for me, Carter? Emily Carter. Alvarez typed lazily, more out of boredom than obligation, and for a moment nothing happened. Then his eyebrows rose just slightly and he leaned closer to the screen. Huh. What? Nothing's coming up. What do you mean nothing's coming up? I mean nothing. Alvarez frowned, tried a different search string than another. There's a name, there's a rank, there's a birth date. Everything else is just gone, like someone scrubbed it. I've never seen a file this thin on an active duty officer. Reyes felt something cold settle in his stomach. Is that normal? No, Alvarez said slowly. It's really not. This is the kind of file you see on people who don't officially exist. He glanced up at Reyes, suddenly uneasy. You didn't hear that from me, and you probably shouldn't be asking about this at all. Reyes left the records office more unsettled than when he'd walked in, the earlier memory of Emily's silhouette against the fence line now taking on a weight it hadn't carried before. Whoever Emily Carter was, she wasn't simply an officer with an unusual skill set. She was someone whose entire existence had been deliberately erased from the system, and in his experience, the only people who received that kind of treatment were the ones the Corps needed to protect the most, or the ones the Corps needed to hide the most. He wasn't sure yet which one Emily was. He was about to find out that the answer was both. That evening, Master Sergeant Daniel Brooks made a decision he'd been circling for 2 full days. He found Emily alone near the motor pool, checking straps on a supply crate destined for the following morning's staging area. And this time he didn't bother with subtlety. I know that grip, he said without preamble. Emily's hands stilled on the strap just for a heartbeat before resuming their work. Excuse me. The way you carry an equipment case. Left hand weight along the forearm. I've seen exactly one person carry gear that way in 15 years of service. Brooks stepped closer, his voice low, urgent, carrying none of the mockery Mitchell and Dawson had aimed at her weeks earlier. Only something that sounded almost like desperation. 3 years ago, a canyon operation gone bad. My team was pinned down, no extraction, no comms, about 6 hours from being wiped off the map entirely. And then someone appeared out of the dark and started calling out enemy positions before we could even see them. Someone we never saw clearly. Someone who vanished before dawn without a word. Emily said nothing, her expression carefully, deliberately blank. I only ever heard a call sign, Brooks continued, his voice dropping almost to a whisper now. Command wouldn't confirm anything, wouldn't even acknowledge the operation happened. But every man on my team who made it home swore they heard it over the radio that night, right before the enemy position went dark. He looked directly into her eyes, Iron Wolf. The name hung in the air between them like a struck match. For a long moment, Emily didn't move, didn't blink, didn't give away a single flicker of confirmation or denial. Then quietly, in a voice stripped of all pretense, Where did you hear that name, Master Sergeant? I just told you where I heard it. That's not what I'm asking. I know it isn't. Brooks held her gaze unwavering. I'm asking if it's you. Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything neither of them was saying. Somewhere behind them, an engine turned over in the motor pool, and a group of Marines laughed at something too far away to make out. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice barely above the wind. Some names are safer left as rumors. Sergeant Brooks, for your sake, for mine, for the men and women who might still need that name to mean nothing at all. That's not a no. No, she agreed softly. It isn't. She picked up the crate and walked away without another word, leaving Brooks standing alone in the fading light, his heart pounding with the particular vertigo of a man who has just confirmed a truth he spent 3 years telling himself was impossible. He didn't sleep at all that night. By the third day, tension had settled over Fort Redstone like a held breath. Dawson never wanted to let uncertainty sit quietly, cornered Reyes near the mess hall, and demanded to know what he'd found in the records office, word having traveled, as it always did, through the same invisible channels that carried every piece of gossip across a base this size. You went digging on Carter, Dawson said. It wasn't a question. Reyes hesitated. I was curious. And, and there's nothing there, Dawson. Her file's basically empty. Not redacted empty, erased empty, like she never officially existed before she showed up here. Dawson's easy grin faltered for the first time since Emily had arrived. That's not possible. Everybody's got a file. Not her. So what, she's some kind of ghost? I don't know what she is. Reyes lowered his voice, glancing around the mess hall before continuing. But I know what I saw on Perimeter Watch 4 nights ago. She was behind the fence line behind me without making a sound. I didn't hear her, didn't see her coming. Nothing. 1 second I was alone. Next second she's talking in my ear, like she'd been standing there the whole time. You're serious. Dead serious. Dawson sat back processing this, the pieces of the last 2 weeks rearranging themselves in his mind. The scrub brush, she never complained about the medical log. She'd somehow noticed and remembered the smoke charge she predicted. Before it detonated the terrain contours, she'd memorized well enough to save an entire squad from injury. We made her clean boots, he said slowly, almost to himself. We made her carry water crates alone. We laughed at her. Yeah. Reyes, what if she's not just good? What if she's... He trailed off, unable to finish the thought because finishing it meant confronting exactly how badly they had misjudged the quiet woman who'd stepped off that transport truck 2 weeks earlier. Across the mess hall, unaware of the conversation happening about her, Emily ate alone as she always did, steady, unbothered, patient, in a way that suggested she had weathered far worse than whispers and misjudgment, and intended to weather this too exactly as calmly as everything else. The morning of the 4th day arrived with a tension nobody could quite name. Colonel Hayes called the final briefing at 0600, laying out the parameters of the desert combat simulation with the flat, practiced efficiency of a man who had run this exercise a dozen times before and expected this year to be no different from any other. 2-team engagement, he said, pointing to the terrain map pinned to the briefing board. Team 1 inserts from the North Ridge, Team 2 from the Eastern Canyon approach. Objective is a simulated reconnaissance rescue, a downed observation unit trapped in hostile controlled terrain. Full field conditions, live coordination, minimal outside support consistent with real-world extraction scenarios. His eyes moved across the assembled squad leaders before settling briefly on Mitchell. Sergeant Mitchell, your team will take the forward canyon position. Understood, this is the most demanding assignment on the board. Understood, sir. Captain Carter is attached to your unit as forward observer per your request 4 days ago. Hayes's tone carried the faintest edge of skepticism, as if even now he wasn't entirely convinced the assignment made sense. I trust you've briefed her accordingly. Yes, sir. Mitchell's voice was steady, but something in his eyes had changed since that request 4 days earlier, the smug certainty replaced by something far less comfortable. Something that looked almost like doubt. As the briefing broke and squads dispersed to gear up, Brooks caught Mitchell's arm before he could walk away. A word, Brooks said quietly. Kind of busy, Master Sergeant. This won't take long. Brooks lowered his voice further, glancing around to ensure no one else was in earshot. Whatever you think you know about Captain Carter, whatever you think this exercise is going to prove, I'd reconsider forming an opinion before it's over. Mitchell frowned. You know something. I know a great deal more than I did 4 days ago. Brooks's expression was unreadable, carefully neutral, the look of a man choosing his words with the precision of someone diffusing something delicate. I'd advise you to trust her instincts out there today. Whatever she tells you to do, however strange it sounds, trust it. You're not making sense. I know. Brooks released his arm. You'll understand soon enough. Everyone will. He walked away before Mitchell could press further, leaving the sergeant standing alone in the thinning crowd, staring after him with a growing uneasy certainty that the desert simulation about to unfold was not going to be the exercise he'd planned 4 days ago. Not even close. Gear up took 40 minutes. Mitchell moved through his squad, checking straps, checking radios, checking weapons loaded with training blanks, and found himself more than once glancing toward the far end of the staging area where Emily was checking her own equipment with the same unhurried, methodical precision she brought to everything. She'd swapped her standard issue gear for something different this morning. A lighter pack, a different holster, configuration boots laced in a pattern he didn't recognize. Small details, the kind of details nobody would notice unless they were already looking for them. Mitchell was looking for them now. You ready? He asked, approaching her. I'm ready. Look, Carter, He hesitated, unsure exactly what he wanted to say, the words tangled somewhere between apology and warning. Whatever happens out there today, I need you to follow the formation. No freelancing. This isn't like the smoke charge drill. Real terrain, longer exposure, higher stakes. I can't have you going off script. Emily met his eyes, calm and steady as always. I'll follow the formation, Sergeant. Until following it stops keeping your men alive. That's not exactly reassuring. It's not meant to be reassuring. It's meant to be honest. She shouldered her pack, adjusting the strap with practiced ease. You asked for this assignment 4 days ago because you wanted to see what I was really made of. You're about to get your answer. Mitchell opened his mouth to respond, but the words never came. Because at that exact moment, the staging horn sounded across the yard, sharp, final, impossible to ignore, signaling that the largest, most demanding exercise Fort Redstone ran all year was about to begin. And somewhere beyond the canyon walls waiting for them, a scenario was already unfolding that no one on that staging ground could have predicted, one that would take a training exercise and turn it within the hour into something devastatingly real. Mitchell shouldered his rifle, gave the order to move out, and led his squad toward the eastern canyon approach, utterly unaware that within the next 2 hours he would be watching the quiet woman he had once handed a scrub brush move through hostile terrain with a precision that would leave the entire base speechless, and that a veteran master sergeant's radio call would echo across Fort Redstone's command network, forever changing the way every Marine on that base understood the meaning of the name Iron Wolf. 6 minutes into the insertion, the canyon swallowed every sound except boots on rock and breath moving through dry throats. Mitchell led from the front rifle, low and ready eyes, cutting left and right along walls that rose higher the deeper the squad pushed. Behind him, Dawson kept pace with the second fire team, muttering coordinates under his breath into a radio that crackled more than it should have this early in the exercise. Reyes walked the middle of the formation, young enough that his hand still gripped his weapon a fraction too tight, old enough now to know better than to say so out loud. And at the rear, exactly where Mitchell had placed her, Emily moved. Not slow, not hesitant, just quiet in a way that made the rest of the squad feel loud by comparison. Contact left, Dawson called out, freezing mid-step, rifle snapping toward a shadow that resolved a half-second later into nothing more than a shifting patch of scrub brush caught in the wind. Clear, Mitchell said, exhaling. Eyes forward. Stay sharp, this terrain's a maze. Copy. Nobody noticed that Emily hadn't moved her weapon at all. She'd already clocked the shadow for what it was 3 seconds before Dawson raised his rifle and simply hadn't seen the need to react to something that was never a threat. Nobody noticed, except Reyes. He fell back half a step, letting the formation drift ahead of him, just enough to walk beside her. You didn't even flinch. It wasn't anything. How'd you know that before Dawson did? Wind patterns, she said quietly. Brush moves different when something's hiding in it versus when it's just caught in a gust. You learn to tell the difference. Where do you learn something like that? Emily's eyes flicked forward toward Mitchell's back, toward the narrowing canyon walls ahead. Somewhere you hope you never have to go, Reyes. He wanted to press further. He'd wanted to press further for 4 days now, but something about the flatness in her voice told him this wasn't the moment, and he let it go, falling back into step with the rest of the squad, just as Mitchell's hand shot up in a silent signal to halt. At the same moment, 7 miles back at Fort Redstone's command post, Colonel Hayes stood over a bank of monitors with his arms crossed, watching squad positions blink steadily across a tactical display. Beside him, Master Sergeant Daniel Brooks hadn't taken his eyes off the eastern canyon marker in almost 10 minutes. You're hovering, Master Sergeant, Hayes said without looking up. I have concerns about the terrain selection for Team 2, sir. The terrain's the same terrain we run every year. With respect, sir, the personnel isn't. Hayes finally glanced up, one eyebrow raised. You're talking about Captain Carter. I am. You requested her file 3 days ago. Records came back clean. Records came back empty, sir. That's not the same thing. Brooks kept his voice low controlled, but there was an edge under it that hadn't been there a week ago. I'd like to formally recommend we route a secondary comms relay through her position specifically. If anything happens out there, she may be the only asset with the training to hold that formation together. Hayes studied him for a long moment, something skeptical and searching in his expression. That's an unusual request for an officer you can't even confirm has combat experience. I can't confirm it on paper, sir. I can confirm it because I've seen it before 3 years ago in a canyon that looked a lot like the one Sergeant Mitchell's squad just walked into. Something in Brooks' tone made Hayes pause. He didn't fully understand what the master sergeant meant, but 17 years of command instinct told him this wasn't a moment to dismiss. Route the relay, Hayes said finally. But if this turns into nothing, Master Sergeant, we're having a longer conversation about your judgment. Understood, sir. Brooks exhaled relief and dread tangled together in equal measure because some part of him already knew this exercise wasn't going to turn into nothing. Back in the canyon, Mitchell's raised fist brought the squad to a full stop. What is it? Dawson whispered. Trip line. Mitchell crouched, examining a thin strand of wire strung ankle height across the narrow passage ahead, nearly invisible against the packed dirt. Simulated pressure trigger. Standard course obstacle. Standard where they usually put it 50 meters further up, a voice said from the rear. Every head turned. Emily had moved forward without anyone noticing, crouching beside Mitchell to examine the wire herself. This isn't course placement. Look at the anchor point. It's been staked into rock that wasn't here on last year's terrain layout. How would you know what was here last year? I studied the archive course maps. 4 days ago, she traced the wire with her eyes, following it up the canyon wall to where it disappeared into a shadowed crevice. This trigger's rigged to something bigger than a smoke charge. Mitchell's jaw tightened. You're saying the range crew changed the layout without logging it. I'm saying somebody did. Whether it was range crew is a different question. What's that supposed to mean? Emily didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed fixed on the crevice above them, calculating something the rest of the squad couldn't see. It means we go around now. We don't have authorization to deviate from the marked road. Sergeant, her voice dropped quiet and absolutely certain, the same tone that had once moved an entire fire team sideways seconds before a smoke charge detonated, where they would have retreated. Trust me on this one. Mitchell looked at the wire, looked at her, remembered despite himself Brooks's warning from that morning. Whatever she tells you to do, however strange it sounds, trust it. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. Team, we're rerouting east single file, stay tight to the wall. Nobody argued, not even Dawson. 11 minutes later, deep enough into the canyon that the sky above had narrowed to a thin ribbon of white heat, the first sign that something had gone genuinely wrong arrived without warning. The ground trembled, not violently, just enough that every Marine in the formation froze mid-step, boots planted, breath caught. Report, Mitchell snapped into his radio. Command, this is Team 2. Did we just feel a controlled detonation? Static answered him, just static, thin and hissing where a response should have been. Command, say again, this is Team 2 requesting. Nothing. Dawson's face had gone pale. Radio's dead. It's not dead, it's just... Mitchell keyed the mic again and adjusted the dial, tried a different frequency. Still nothing. Interference. Has to be interference. Canyon walls this deep, it happens. That's not what that felt like, Reyes said, his voice tight. That felt like ordnance. It's a simulation, Reyes. It's supposed to feel real. Simulations don't shake the ground like that. Emily had already moved to the front of the formation, studying the canyon walls above them, with an intensity that made the hair on the back of Mitchell's neck rise. Sergeant, how much of this exercise is coordinated with the range control tower? All of it. Every charge, every trigger logged and monitored. And how much oversight does range control have on unauthorized foot traffic through restricted terrain? Mitchell's stomach dropped. What are you asking me? I'm asking if anyone else is supposed to be out here besides us. Nobody answered because nobody knew, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any answer could have. Back at command, the tremor registered on Colonel Hayes' monitors as a spike nobody had scheduled. What was that? Hayes demanded, already moving toward the comms desk. The technician manning the board shook his head, fingers flying across the console. Sir, that wasn't one of our charges. That reading came from outside the exercise perimeter. Outside the perimeter? By how much? Half a click east of Team 2's position. Sir, I'm also showing... He paused, frowning at his screen. I'm showing intermittent signal loss across the entire eastern relay. Not just Team 2. The whole grid out there just went dark. Brooks felt something cold settle into his chest, the same feeling he remembered from a canyon 3 years ago, right before everything had gone sideways, in ways no training exercise ever had. Colonel, he said, I need you to authorize direct comms priority to Captain Carter's position. Immediately. On what grounds? On the grounds that if I'm right about who she is, she's the only person out there who's going to know what just happened before it gets worse. Hayes hesitated only a moment before nodding sharply to the technician. Do it! Route everything through her position. In the canyon, the second tremor came 4 minutes later, closer. This time followed almost immediately by a sound that made every Marine in the formation drop instinctively into cover. Gunfire. Not the sharp, hollow crack of blank training rounds. Something deeper. Something real enough that the difference registered in every trained ear on that formation at the exact same moment, a half-second of shared, silent horror rippling through the squad. That's live fire, Dawson said, voice cracking. That's actual live fire. It's not us, Mitchell said, scanning wildly. Nobody's cleared for live rounds on this exercise. That's not... I know it's not us. Sergeant, I'm asking who the hell else is out here? Reyes had gone completely still, pressed against the canyon wall, eyes wide, breath shallow. Carter! Carter, what is that? Emily didn't answer immediately. She'd already moved low and fast to a shelf of rock, offering a narrow line of sight up the canyon toward the sound, her whole body coiled with a focus none of them had seen from her before, not even during the smoke charge drill. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed entirely. Gone was the quiet, deferential officer who'd scrubbed boots without complaint for 2 weeks. What replaced it was something colder, something absolutely certain. Everyone down, now, nobody moves until I say. Nobody argued this time, nobody even hesitated. The radio crackled back to life so suddenly that Mitchell nearly dropped it. Team 2, this is Command. Do you copy? Over? Command, this is Mitchell. We copy. We have a situation. I say again, we have unidentified live fire approximately 300 meters north of our position. Request immediate. Team 2, stand by. A pause, static hissing, and then a different voice cut through, older, rougher, carrying an authority that made even Mitchell straighten instinctively. This is Master Sergeant Brooks. Is Captain Carter with your formation? Mitchell glanced toward Emily, still crouched on the rock shelf, still scanning the terrain above with an intensity that hadn't broken for even a second. She's here. Put her on. Mitchell handed the radio over without a word, and Emily took it, her eyes never leaving the canyon rim above them. This is Carter. Emily. Brooks's voice dropped quiet enough that only she and Mitchell standing close could fully hear it. Tell me what you're seeing. Muzzle flash patterns inconsistent with training rounds. Whoever's up there isn't running our exercise. They're running their own. Her eyes narrowed, tracking something the rest of the squad couldn't see. Movement along the north ridge. 3, maybe 4 individuals. Not Marine formation, not Marine gear. Mitchell's blood went cold. You're saying we have hostiles inside a training exercise. I'm saying somebody used our exercise as cover. Emily's grip on the radio tightened her jaw, setting into a hard, focused line that Mitchell had never seen on her before. Brooks, I need you to pull every unengaged unit off this range immediately. This isn't a drill anymore. Copy that. Working on it now. A pause heavy with everything unsaid. Emily, whatever you need to do out there, do it. The radio clicked off, and for a long, suspended moment, nobody in the formation moved. Nobody breathed the weight of what had just been confirmed, settling over all of them at once. Dawson was the first to break the silence, his voice barely a whisper. Did he just say hostiles, real hostiles, on our own training range? That's exactly what he said, Mitchell answered, and for the first time since Emily had stepped off that transport truck 2 weeks ago, there was no mockery left in his voice at all. Only fear, sharp and honest, and underneath it, something that hadn't been there before. Trust. 20 minutes into what had once been a training exercise and was now something else entirely, the squad moved through the canyon in tight, silent formation, every instinct screaming at them to run, and every ounce of discipline holding them together instead. Emily led now. Nobody had assigned her the position. Nobody needed to. 2-man teams, she said quietly, gesturing with 2 fingers toward a fork in the canyon path ahead. Dawson Webb, you take the left approach. Stay low, stay quiet. Reyes, you're with me. Copy, Dawson said, and moved without hesitation, without a single trace of the arrogance he'd carried 2 weeks ago when he'd shoved a scrub brush into her hands. Reyes fell in beside her, his heart hammering so hard he was certain she could hear it. Carter, Emily, whatever your name actually is, are we going to make it out of here? She glanced at him, and for just a moment, something almost gentle crossed her expression. Stay close to me. Do exactly what I say, exactly when I say it. And yes, Reyes, we're going to make it out of here. You sound very sure of that. I've done this before. How many times? She didn't answer, and Reyes decided in that moment that he didn't actually want to know. They'd gone maybe 60 meters when the ground gave way beneath Reyes's boot. It happened fast, faster than thought, a loose shelf of rock crumbling under his weight without warning, and suddenly he was falling, sliding down a narrow gully with nothing but jagged stone rushing past him and a scream caught somewhere in his throat that never quite made it out. Reyes. Emily moved before anyone else even fully registered what had happened, dropping into the gully after him with a controlled, deliberate speed that defied every instinct telling a human body to hesitate before a fall like that. She caught his pack strap 6 feet down, planted her boot against an outcrop, and hauled him sideways onto a narrow ledge with a strength that seemed impossible from someone her size. Reyes lay there for a moment, gasping, his ankles screaming with pain, blood running from a shallow gash along his forearm. "You're okay, Emily said, already assessing the injury with quick, efficient hands. "Ankle's not broken. Sprained badly, but not broken. Can you put weight on it?" "I don't." He winced as she tested it gently. "Maybe, a little." "That'll have to be enough." She glanced back up the gully toward the rest of the squad, now scrambling down to help, her eyes sweeping the canyon rim above with the same unbroken vigilance she'd maintained since the first gunshot. "We're not stopping here. Whoever's up on that ridge heard you fall." "How do you know that?" "Because I would have." Mitchell reached them seconds later, breathless, eyes wide with a fear he no longer bothered hiding. He'll live. We need to move." Emily was already helping Reyes to his feet, taking most of his weight against her shoulder despite the awkward angle, despite the fact that he outweighed her by a solid 40 pounds. "Sergeant Radio Command, tell them we have one wounded ambulatory and we're moving to the fallback position you scouted 4 days ago." "There is no fallback position we never scouted." "There is now." Her eyes met his, hard and certain. "Trust me, Sergeant. I told you I studied this terrain. There's a defensible position 200 meters south, natural rock formation, single approach point. We can hold there until extraction." Mitchell stared at her for exactly 1 second, weighing 2 weeks of doubt against everything he'd watched her do in the last 20 minutes. "You heard her," he barked at the squad. "South Ridge defensible position, move, move, move." They reached the formation 4 minutes later, and Emily's assessment proved with almost unnerving precision to be exactly correct. A natural fold in the rock created a shielded pocket with only one viable approach, easily covered by 2 Marines with clear sightlines. "How did you know this was here?" Dawson asked, breathless, settling into position along the rock's edge. "I told you, I studied the terrain from a map 4 days ago, and you remembered the exact coordinates of a rock formation that isn't on any official course layout." Emily didn't answer him directly. She was already scanning the canyon behind them, radio pressed to her ear, listening to a stream of chatter that made her expression harden with every passing second. "Command, say again, how many confirmed?" "Hostiles." Static, then Brooks's voice tight with urgency. "Confirmed visual on 4 individuals, unknown affiliation, moving parallel to your squad's last known position. We've got aerial support inbound, but it's 15 minutes out at best." 15 minutes is a long time out here. "I know it is." Emily lowered the radio. Her jaw set and turned to face the squad, 6 frightened, exhausted Marines looking to her now, with an expression none of them had worn 2 weeks ago when she'd first stepped off that transport truck, and they'd handed her a bucket of dirty water without a second thought. "Listen to me," she said, her voice carrying a calm that steadied every person within earshot. "We hold this position. We do not engage unless engaged first. 15 minutes is survivable if we stay disciplined. I need every one of you exactly where I put you, exactly when I put you there. Can you do that?" A ragged chorus of "yes, ma'am" rippled through the formation, and even Mitchell, standing at the edge of the group, found himself nodding along with this rest of them. Some part of the arrogance he'd carried for 2 weeks finally completely dissolving. "Good," Emily said, raising her weapon, her eyes fixed on the canyon rim above every ounce of the quiet, unassuming officer, replaced now by something the entire squad was only beginning to understand. Because the woman standing between them and whatever was moving through that canyon wasn't simply skilled. She was something else entirely. Something they'd laughed at and doubted and underestimated for 2 straight weeks. And as the first distant shape appeared on the ridgeline above, silhouetted against the white desert sky, Emily's voice dropped to barely a whisper, steady and absolutely unshaken. Hold your positions. Nobody fires until I give the order. Behind her, Mitchell keyed his radio one final time, his voice tight with a fear he no longer bothered disguising. Command, this is Team 2. We are pinned, one wounded, hostile contact imminent, requesting immediate reinforcement. The response that came back was not from Colonel Hayes. It was Brooks, and his voice, cutting through the static, carried a weight that made every Marine in that rock formation go still. Team 2, hold what you've got. Reinforcement is already moving, and Mitchell listened to me very carefully. Whatever Captain Carter tells you to do, from this point forward, you do it without question. Do you understand me? Mitchell looked at Emily, crouched and utterly focused at the edge of their small, fragile shelter, watching the ridgeline with the stillness of someone who had stood in exactly this kind of moment more times than anyone at Fort Redstone would ever fully know. Copy that, Command, he said quietly. Understood. Above them, the first silhouette on the ridge shifted, raised something long and dark, and the desert went utterly, terrifyingly silent. The shape on the ridge didn't fire. It simply held there, black against the white sky, weapon raised, but not yet trained on anything specific. And in that suspended half-second, Emily's entire body went still, in a way that made Mitchell's chest tighten with something close to panic. Carter, don't move. Her voice was barely a breath. Don't move, don't speak, don't even blink. Nobody argued, nobody dared. She watched the silhouette for 3 full seconds that felt like 3 full minutes, reading something in its posture that the rest of the squad couldn't begin to interpret: the angle of the shoulders, the way the weapon hung slightly loose instead of locked into a firing stance, the small telltale hesitation of someone scanning rather than someone hunting. Scout, she finally whispered. Not in assault position. He's looking not engaging. That's supposed to make me feel better, Dawson hissed. It means we have a window. Not long, but a window. Emily's eyes never left the ridge. Reyes, radio, now quiet as you can. Reyes, wincing against the pain in his ankle, passed it over without a sound. Command, this is Carter. Her voice had dropped into something clipped and professional, stripped of every ounce of warmth. We have a single scout on elevated terrain approximately 40 meters north of our position, requesting status on the reinforcement Brooks mentioned. Static hissed for 2 agonizing seconds before Brooks's voice cut through low and urgent. Reinforcement is 6 minutes out. Carter, listen, this isn't isolated. We just got word from base perimeter. A Marine patrol got hit 20 minutes ago on a security sweep east of the range, same general sector. Comms went dark on them too before the interference started on your end. Mitchell's face drained of color. Wait, there's another squad out here, actually pinned, actually engaged. Confirmed hostile contact, yes. Brooks's voice tightened further. 4, possibly 5 armed individuals, cross-border smuggling element, according to preliminary intel, and it looks like your training range sits directly across their exfil route. They didn't wander into your exercise by accident, Sergeant. Your exercise wandered into their escape corridor. The words landed like a physical blow. Every Marine in that rock formation processed it at roughly the same moment. This wasn't a freak coincidence, wasn't a training malfunction, wasn't some tragic scheduling overlap. They'd walked unarmed with anything but blanks in half their weapons straight into the edge of an active firefight involving armed combatants who had already engaged a separate Marine patrol somewhere beyond the canyon walls. How many of our men are hurt? Emily asked, her voice flat, controlled, giving away nothing. Unknown. That patrol's comms are still down. We've got a QRF spinning up now, but Carter, Brooks paused, and something in that pause carried more weight than anything he'd said so far. We don't have a specialist who can identify hostile positions at range in this terrain. Not fast enough, not before more of our people get hurt. Silence stretched across the radio. Emily closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed, entirely quieter but somehow harder, carrying a certainty that made the hair rise on the back of Mitchell's neck. Copy that, Command. I'm moving. Moving where? Mitchell grabbed her arm before she could rise. Carter, we're pinned down, 1 wounded. We don't even have confirmed numbers on that scout. I have a job to do, Sergeant, and it's not sitting in this rock formation waiting for someone else to solve this. You don't have authorization. I don't need authorization. She pulled her arm free gently but firmly and reached for the equipment case she'd carried untouched strapped to her pack since the moment she'd stepped off that transport truck 2 weeks ago. Nobody had ever seen what was inside it. Nobody had ever asked because nobody had ever imagined it mattered. She opened it now. Dawson's breath caught audibly. Inside wasn't paperwork, wasn't administrative equipment, wasn't anything remotely resembling what a cadet from headquarters would carry into a training exercise. A compact, long-range optics system, a specialized comms relay unit, unlike anything standard issue at Fort Redstone. A weapon component kit assembled with the kind of precision that spoke of years, not weeks of familiarity. What Anna Dawson said slowly is all of that. Tools. Emily said already assembling pieces with hands that move faster than thought, faster than anyone in that formation had ever seen hands move. The kind of tools that don't get issued to admin cadets. Mitchell stared at her, and something inside him, the last stubborn thread of doubt he'd been clinging to since she'd stepped off that truck, finally completely snapped. "Who are you?" he asked, and this time it wasn't mockery. It wasn't suspicion. It was something closer to awe. Emily didn't answer right away. She finished assembling the optics, slung it across her back, and rose into a low crouch, scanning the terrain ahead with an intensity that made the entire squad go quiet around her. "Later, Sergeant," she said. "Right now, people are bleeding somewhere out there, and I'm the only person on this range who can find them before it's too late." She moved before anyone could stop her, slipping over the edge of the rock formation and disappearing into the canyon terrain with a silence that defied physics, defied everything the squad had watched her demonstrate over the past 2 weeks, and somehow still exceeded it. "Carter, wait!" Reyes tried to push himself upright, ankles screaming in protest, and collapsed back down with a hiss of pain. "Stay down," Mitchell ordered, though his own eyes were fixed on the spot where Emily had vanished, some tangled mixture of fear and awe holding his chest tight. "Dawson, keep eyes on that scout position. Nobody fires unless fired upon. We hold here." "And her?" Dawson asked. "We just let her go out there alone." Mitchell didn't answer immediately because he didn't have an answer. 2 weeks ago, he would have said absolutely not, would have called it reckless, would have court-martialed the thought before it finished forming. But 2 weeks ago, he also thought she was a paper pusher who couldn't tell a rifle from a filing cabinet. "She knows what she's doing," he finally said, and hated how uncertain his own voice sounded even as he said it. 400 meters north in terrain, the squad hadn't even known existed until Emily led them to a position that wasn't on any official course layout. The sound of gunfire grew sharper, closer, more frequent, no longer distant echoes bouncing off canyon walls, but distinct individual reports that meant someone somewhere was actively engaged in a fight for their life. Emily moved through the terrain like something poured rather than walking, using dead ground and shadow with an instinct that had been carved into her over years. She rarely allowed herself to think about. She keyed her radio voice barely above a whisper. "Command Carter, I have visual on the secondary contact zone. I count 3 hostiles elevated position engaging what looks like a 4-man marine element pinned in a wash below them." "Copy, Carter, that's the patrol. Do you have eyes on wounded? 1 down, not moving. I'm working to confirm status." She adjusted her optic brace, steady hands rock still despite the gunfire cracking closer with every passing second. "Command, I need that QRF redirected to my coordinates, not the original contact point. The scout on Team 2's ridge was a diversion. The real engagement is here." A pause, static crackling, and then Brooks's voice tight with something that sounded almost like fear for her specifically. "Emily, that puts you between 3 armed hostiles and a pinned patrol with 0 support. You are not equipped for a solo engagement." "I'm not planning a solo engagement, Master Sergeant. I'm planning to buy that patrol enough time to survive until support arrives." Her voice never wavered, never rose steady as stone, even as she settled into a firing position along a shelf of rock overlooking the wash below. "Redirect the QRF. I'll hold the gap. Emily." "Brooks." Her voice softened just slightly, just enough for the weight of what she was about to say to land the way she needed it to. "I've held worse gaps than this one. Trust me the way you trusted the person who saved your team 3 years ago, because it's the same person asking now." Silence. Then quietly, almost too quiet for the radio to fully carry, "Copy that, QRF redirecting now. Emily, hold on." "Always do." Below her in the wash, 4 Marines pressed themselves against a low rock embankment. one of them bleeding heavily from the shoulder, the other three trading sporadic fire with positions above that had them pinned so thoroughly none of them could risk lifting their heads for more than half a second at a time. "We are not making it out of this wash," one of them shouted over the gunfire voice, cracking with exhaustion and adrenaline. "Torres needs a medevac now, not in 20 minutes. 20 minutes is what we've got Sanchez, so figure out how to make it work." Above them, unseen, unheard, Emily settled her breathing into the same rhythm she trained into her body more years ago than most of the Marines at Fort Redstone had been alive, and made the calculation that separated operators like her from every other soldier on that range. 3 hostiles, 1 clear angle, a window measured in seconds. She keyed her body one final time. "Command Carter, initiating suppression to relieve pressure on the pinned patrol. Advise all units of controlled fire, only minimize exposure." "Copy, Carter. God be with you." She didn't answer that. She simply exhaled, steadied, and moved. What happened over the next 90 seconds would be retold at Fort Redstone for years afterward, though never with full accuracy because nobody who witnessed it from a distance ever fully understood what they were watching, and Emily herself would never volunteer the details. The first hostile position went silent so suddenly, so cleanly, that the remaining 2 initially assumed equipment malfunction rather than enemy action, a costly assumption that gave Emily the additional 2 seconds she needed to reposition before they understood the wash below them was no longer their only threat. "Contact above," one of them shouted, swinging his weapon upward, and for the first time since this entire nightmare had begun, Emily's voice carried across open air instead of a radio frequency sharp and commanding, aimed directly at the pinned patrol below. "Marines, this is friendly, forward observer, suppress and advance to the northern rock line. Now you have a 5-second window." Sanchez didn't hesitate, didn't question where the voice had come from or why it carried the kind of authority that made his body move before his brain finished processing the order. You heard her. Move, move, move. The 4 Marines broke cover in a controlled scramble. Torres dragged between 2 of them, weapons still firing behind them in disciplined bursts, and the remaining hostile position caught between an unexpected suppressing angle above and a patrol suddenly moving instead of pinned made the mistake that ended the engagement. He hesitated. Emily didn't. By the time the QRF arrived 6 minutes later, roaring up the access road in 2 armored transports with Colonel Hayes himself in the lead vehicle, the wash had gone silent, and what they found stopped every single one of them cold. 4 Marines alive, 1 wounded but stable, a field dressing already applied with a precision that spoke of someone who'd done this exact procedure more times than anyone wanted to imagine. 3 hostiles neutralized, restrained, secured. And standing at the edge of it all, radio in hand, calmly reporting a sitrep as though she'd simply completed a routine patrol, was the quiet woman half the base had spent 2 weeks calling an admin cadet. Colonel Hayes climbed out of the lead vehicle, staring at the scene, then at Emily, then back at the scene, visibly struggling to reconcile what his eyes were showing him with everything he thought he understood about the officer standing in front of him. "Captain Carter," he said slowly. "Report." "Sir, patrol secured 1 wounded requiring immediate medevac, 3 hostiles detained pending transfer to base security. Recommend full terrain sweep to confirm no additional elements in the sector." Hayes opened his mouth closed. It opened it again. "How did you—" "Sir, with respect, we can debrief fully once the wounded are stabilized." Her voice remained perfectly level, perfectly professional, as if she hadn't just single-handedly turned the tide of an active firefight in under 2 minutes. Behind Hayes, climbing out of the second vehicle, Master Sergeant Daniel Brooks stood frozen, staring at Emily across the wash with an expression that mixed relief so profound it was almost physical pain. 3 years. 3 years of wondering. 3 years of carrying a nameless file at the bottom of his gear bag. 3 years of telling himself the operator who'd saved his team in that other canyon half a world away was a story he'd never fully understand. And here she was, standing in front of him, confirmed beyond any possibility of doubt, not by a grip technique or an erased file, but by the exact same impossible precision he'd watched save lives once before and had just watched save lives again. He walked toward her slowly, and the entire wash, Hayes, Sanchez, the wounded Torres being loaded for transport, every soldier present seemed to hold its breath as he approached. "Captain Carter," he said, his voice carrying just far enough for everyone nearby to hear it clearly. "Master Sergeant." Brooks stood at attention, something raw and unguarded breaking through the discipline in his face. 3 years ago, a canyon a long way from here. My team was 6 hours from being wiped off the map, and somebody appeared out of the dark and gave us a chance nobody thought we had. His voice thickened. I never got a name, only a call sign. I've carried that call sign in my gear for 3 years, waiting to find out if it belonged to a real person or a story soldiers tell each other to make the dark feel less empty. Emily said nothing. Her expression unreadable, though something behind her eyes had softened in a way none of the Marines at Fort Redstone had ever seen. Brooks reached for his radio. Everyone hold position, he said into it, his voice carrying across every open channel on the base, across the entire command network, across every ear at Fort Redstone, still listening for news from the Eastern Range. A pause. The whole desert seemed to lean in. Then quiet, unshaken, absolutely certain. Iron Wolf, stand by. The words hit the command network like a detonation. Back at the command post, the technician manning the comms desk froze mid-motion headset halfway to his ears, staring at the radio as though it had just spoken in a language he'd only ever heard in rumor. Colonel Hayes, standing not 10 feet from Brooks, turned slowly, processing the two words with the same disbelief rippling through every Marine within earshot. Out at the rock formation where Mitchell's squad still held position, Dawson nearly dropped his rifle. Did he just say? He said Iron Wolf. Reyes breathed, propped against the rock with his injured ankle stretched out in front of him, staring at the radio in Mitchell's hand as though it might explain itself further. Mitchell, he said Iron Wolf. Mitchell said nothing at first. He simply stood there, radio in hand, replaying the last 2 weeks in his mind, at a speed that made his head spin. The bucket of water, the scrub brush, the boots, the water crates carried, alone the medical log. She'd somehow noticed and never forgotten the smoke charge she'd predicted before it detonated, the terrain contours, memorized in a single night, the footsteps that made no sound on gravel, the grip Brooks had recognized from a canyon 3 years ago. Every piece he'd dismissed, every piece he'd mocked, every single one of them had been telling him the truth from the very first day, and he'd been too busy laughing to listen. Oh God, he said quietly, we made her scrub floors. We made her clean 40 pairs of boots. Dawson added, his voice hollow with the particular horror of a man realizing exactly how badly he'd misjudged someone. We handed her a cleaning brush on her first day and told her to learn how things work. She's Iron Wolf, Reyes said, still staring at the radio. The Iron Wolf, the one from the stories. The one the old guys used to talk about like she was half legend, half ghost story. She's not a legend, Mitchell said slowly, understanding, finally completely settling over him like a physical weight. She's real. She's been standing next to us the entire time, and we treated her like she was nothing. Nobody spoke for a long moment after that, the desert wind carrying nothing but the distant hum of the QRF vehicles and the fading adrenaline of a firefight that had impossibly ended without a single Marine casualty on either engaged front. Back at the wash, Emily finally allowed herself the smallest exhale, the tension of the last 20 minutes bleeding slowly out of her shoulders. Now that the wounded were secured, the hostiles restrained, and the immediate danger passed. You knew, she said quietly to Brooks, the two of them standing slightly apart from the others. Now the roar of the QRF vehicles and the murmur of soldiers processing what had just happened, providing enough cover for a private moment. Since the equipment shed, you've known for days. I suspected, Brooks corrected. I didn't know, not until just now. He studied her, something raw still sitting behind his eyes. Why didn't you say something? At any point over the last 2 weeks, you could have said something. Instead, you let them treat you like nothing, Emily finished for him, and there was no bitterness in it, just a tired, worn honesty that had clearly been carried a long time. I let them, Brooks, because it's not the first base I've walked into and it won't be the last, and I stopped expecting people to look past the surface a long time ago. It's easier to let the work speak instead of my mouth. Easier, not fair. Fair's a luxury, Master Sergeant. I gave up on it around the same time I earned this call sign. She glanced toward the rock formation in the distance, where Mitchell's squad was visible now, gathering themselves for the walk back, Reyes limping between two supporting shoulders. They're good Marines under all that noise. They just needed a reason to see past what they expected. And now they have one. Now they have one, she agreed quietly. Colonel Hayes approached them, then his expression still carrying the particular disorientation of a commanding officer who had just watched 2 weeks of assumptions collapse in the span of 20 minutes. "Captain Carter," he said, choosing his words with visible care, "I owe you a more thorough explanation than the one I'm sure you are willing to give me right now. But I need to know one thing immediately for the safety of this base going forward. Are there more hostiles in this sector, or was this the extent of the threat? Recommend full terrain sweep before confirming, sir. But based on movement patterns and equipment, I observe this looks like an isolated smuggling element that miscalculated their exfil timing against our training schedule. I don't believe this was targeted at Fort Redstone specifically." "You don't believe, but you're not certain." "I'm never certain until I've swept the terrain myself, sir. That's how people stay alive in this line of work." Hayes studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted from disbelief towards something closer to profound respect. "Then I'd like you to lead that sweep, Captain, if you're willing." "Yes, sir." As she turned to gather her equipment, Hayes glanced toward Brooks, lowering his voice. "How long have you known who she really was?" "Truthfully, sir, I didn't fully know until about 90 seconds ago." Brooks watched Emily move toward the tree line, her posture calm, controlled, utterly unaffected by the fact that her entire hidden identity had just been broadcast across the base's command network. "But some part of me has known since the moment I saw her carry that equipment case. I just didn't want to believe it because believing it meant admitting we'd let an operator like that scrub boots for 2 weeks without anyone stopping to ask why a paper pusher moved like she'd survived things most of us only read about in briefings." The walk back to Fort Redstone took nearly 40 minutes. The combined squads moving together now, wounded supported between shoulders, hostiles secured under guard, the desert sun beginning its long slide toward the horizon. Mitchell found himself walking beside Emily, for most of it neither of them saying much, the silence between them carrying a different weight than it had 2 weeks ago. Not hostile, not dismissive, but heavy with everything. He hadn't yet found the words to say. Finally, as the base perimeter came into view in the distance, he spoke. "Captain, I need to say something, and I need you to actually hear it, not just accept it the way you've accepted everything else I've thrown at you the last 2 weeks." Emily glanced at him, waiting. "I was wrong," Mitchell said, the words coming out rougher than he intended, thick with something he wasn't used to expressing. "Not just wrong about who you are, wrong about how I treated you. I looked at you and decided I already knew everything I needed to know, and I was so sure of myself that I never once stopped to actually look." "Sergeant, let me finish." He exhaled hard, staring straight ahead at the approaching base. "You could have told us. Any time in the last 2 weeks, you could have said something, could have pulled rank, could have made us stop. And instead, you let us make fools of ourselves for 2 straight weeks, and then you went out there today and saved 4 Marines' lives without a second of hesitation, including some of the same men who laughed at you on your first day. Is there a question in there, Sergeant? The question is why? Why let it go that far?" Emily was quiet for a moment, her eyes on the base ahead, the same base where 2 weeks earlier she'd stepped off a transport truck to laughter and a bucket of dirty water. "Because respect that's demanded isn't worth much, Sergeant," she said finally. "If I'd walked in flashing a call sign, you'd have respected the reputation. Not me, not the person underneath it. I've spent a long time learning the difference matters more than people think." Mitchell absorbed that in silence, the weight of it settling somewhere he suspected would stay with him for a long time after this deployment ended. "Well," he said, eventually, his voice quieter now, stripped of the last of its old arrogance, "you've got both now, the reputation and the respect, for whatever that's worth." Emily allowed herself the smallest, faintest smile, the first anyone at Fort Redstone had seen from her since she'd arrived. "It's worth more than you'd think, Sergeant." As the gates of Fort Redstone rose ahead of them, the entire base already gathering at the perimeter, word having spread faster than any official announcement ever could. Emily Carter walked back through the same entrance she'd first crossed 2 weeks earlier as an unknown, dismissed, underestimated stranger. She was not walking back through it the same way. And somewhere behind her, carried on radio frequencies that had already reached every corner of the installation, 2 words continued to echo through Fort Redstone's collective memory, words that would follow her for the rest of her time on that base and long after she left it. "Iron Wolf, stand by." The gates hadn't even fully closed behind them before the question started. Colonel Hayes called an emergency debrief within the hour, gathering Mitchell's squad, the rescued patrol, Brooks and Emily into the command briefing room, while the desert sun dropped lower outside the windows, throwing long orange bars of light across a table already crowded with maps, radio logs, and the beginnings of an incident report nobody at Fort Redstone had ever imagined they'd need to file. "Let's start from the top," Hayes said, standing at the head of the table, his voice carrying the flat, controlled tone of a man trying very hard to keep a lid on something enormous. "Captain Carter, I need a full account of what happened out there, and I need it now before this gets reported up the chain and someone above my pay grade decides how the story gets told without any of us in the room." Emily sat straight backed at the far end of the table, hands folded, her expression giving away nothing of the exhaustion that had to be sitting somewhere underneath 2 weeks of quiet endurance and 20 of the most intense minutes of anyone's year. "Sir, at approximately 1100 hours, Team 2 encountered an unlogged trip line during standard canyon insertion. I recommended rerouting based on terrain inconsistencies. 12 minutes later, comms across the eastern grid went dark, followed by confirmed live fire outside the parameters of the exercise. And you determined independently that this was connected to a separate hostile engagement. I determined it was likely, sir, based on the interference pattern in the timing. Master Sergeant Brooks confirmed a second Marine patrol was actively engaged in the same sector." Hayes's eyes moved to Brooks. "You authorized her to move on that information?" "I relayed the information, sir. Captain Carter made the decision to engage independently." Brooks's voice was steady, but there was an edge of protectiveness in it that hadn't been there in any conversation Mitchell had overheard from him before today. "And with respect, sir, if she hadn't made that decision, we'd be having a very different conversation right now. One involving a lot more caskets." The room went quiet at that. Sanchez, seated near the far wall with his arm in a fresh sling, nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on Emily with an expression that mixed gratitude and something close to reverence. "She's not wrong about the caskets," he said quietly. "Torres was bleeding out. We had maybe 10 minutes before that became permanent. She bought us the time we needed. I don't care what regulations she broke to do it." Hayes held up a hand, not unkindly but firmly. "Nobody in this room is questioning the outcome, Sergeant Sanchez. I'm grateful every one of you walked back through those gates today. What I need to understand, what I am required to understand, because there will be people above me asking these exact questions within 24 hours, is how a captain with an official personnel file this thin was carrying specialized equipment onto a training range without command's knowledge and engaged hostile combatants using tactics that go well beyond standard Marine Corps doctrine." Every eye in the room turned toward Emily. She held the colonel's gaze without flinching. "Sir, I understand the concern, and I understand you're going to need answers I may not be authorized to give you in this room. That's not going to be good enough, Captain. Not after today." "No," Emily agreed quietly. "It probably isn't." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Mitchell felt compelled against every instinct telling him to stay quiet in front of a colonel to speak. "Sir, if I may," Hayes glanced at him surprised. "Sergeant Mitchell, I've spent the last 2 weeks treating Captain Carter like she didn't belong here. I made jokes. I assigned her the worst duties on this base. I did everything short of actively sabotaging her, and I did it because I decided the second she stepped off that transport truck that I already knew everything about her." Mitchell's voice tightened, the words clearly costing him something to say out loud in front of the entire room. "I was wrong about all of it. And I think whatever's in that file or not in that file matters a lot less than what every single one of us watched her do today. She didn't just save lives, sir. She held together a squad that had spent 2 weeks disrespecting her, and she did it without hesitation, without complaint, and without asking for a single thing in return." Reyes, propped in a chair with his ankle elevated, nodded firmly. "He's right, sir. Whatever's classified about her, it clearly exists for a reason that has nothing to do with hiding something bad. It's protecting something. Or someone strong." Hayes studied the room for a long moment. Mitchell's uncharacteristic humility, Sanchez's fierce loyalty, Reyes' earnest defense, Dawson standing near the back, arms crossed, saying nothing but nodding along with every word, and something in his posture softened just slightly. "I'm not trying to strip Captain Carter of anything," he said finally, more to the room than to Emily directly. "I'm trying to protect this base and protect her from a chain of command that's going to ask harder questions than I am the moment word of this reaches division." He turned back to Emily, which is why I need you to trust me the way these Marines apparently already do. Give me something I can work with. Not everything, just enough. Emily was quiet for a long moment, weighing something behind carefully controlled eyes. My operational designation is classified above your clearance level, sir. And that's not a decision I have the authority to change, she said finally. But I can confirm this much. I've spent the last several years operating in environments where official documentation puts both myself and the people I've worked alongside at risk. The absence of a file isn't an oversight, Colonel. It's a deliberate protective measure authorized well above this base. Authorized by whom? By people who don't answer to Fort Redstone, sir, or to Division. I'm sorry, that's as far as I can go. Hayes exhaled slowly, running a hand across his face, and for a moment looked less like a colonel and more like a tired man trying to hold together a base that had just been upended in a single afternoon. All right, he said finally. All right, I'll make some calls, quietly, and Captain Carter. He paused, and something almost like respect crept into his voice. Whatever you are, whoever you work for, you saved 4 of my Marines today, and you likely stopped a firefight from spilling further into that canyon and costing this base a great deal more than it already lost. I won't forget that, and I'll make sure it's reflected accurately in whatever report leaves this office. Thank you, sir. As the debrief broke and Marines began filing out, murmuring among themselves in low, stunned voices, Brooks lingered near the door, watching Emily gather the equipment case that had started this entire unraveling. You didn't tell him everything, he said quietly once the room had mostly emptied. I never tell anyone everything, Brooks. That's how the people I care about stay alive. Even me. Emily paused, glancing at him. Especially you. The less you carry, the less anyone can take from you, if they ever come asking. Brooks absorbed that, nodding, slowly understanding a piece of the weight she'd been carrying that he suspected most people never fully grasped. 3 years, I wondered if you were even real. I'm real, Brooks. I know that now. He managed a tired, genuine smile. For what it's worth, Captain Ironwolf, whatever you want me to call you. Thank you. 3 years late, but thank you. Emily allowed herself the faintest smile in return before shouldering her equipment case and walking out into the fading desert light, leaving Brooks standing alone in the empty briefing room with the particular hollowed-out relief of a man who had finally set down a weight he had been carrying for a very long time. Word of what happened in that canyon spread through Fort Redstone with the speed and inevitability of wildfire. And by the time the sun fully set, there wasn't a single soldier on base who hadn't heard some version of the story. The trip line, the ambush, the wounded patrol, the 2 words that had detonated across the command network like a controlled charge. Ironwolf, stand by. In the mess hall that evening, the atmosphere had shifted so completely from 2 weeks earlier that it felt to anyone who'd witnessed both like an entirely different base. Marines who'd never spoken a word to Emily now watched her from across the room with open curiosity, some with awe, a few with the lingering discomfort of men forced to confront exactly how wrong their assumptions had been. Dawson approached her table, a lone tray in hand, and this time there was no smirk on his face, no easy confidence in his posture. Mind if I sit? Emily gestured to the empty seat across from her without a word. Dawson sat staring at his food for a long moment before finally looking up. I handed you a scrub brush on your first day here. I told you to learn how things work. You did? You could have ended my career with a single phone call, 1 word to the right person about how I treated a superior officer, and I'd have been out on my ass before the week was over. That thought never crossed my mind, Corporal. Why not? His voice cracked, slightly genuine confusion and shame tangled together. I disrespected you every single day for 2 weeks. Why didn't you just tell us who you were and end it? Emily set down her fork, considering the question with the same careful weight she seemed to give everything. Because I've spent a long time learning that people who need to be told to respect someone rarely mean it when they finally do. I wanted to see what kind of Marine you were when you thought nobody important was watching. Turns out underneath all the noise, you're not a bad one. That's generous considering. It's honest. You moved fast today when it mattered. You covered your squad without hesitation. You didn't freeze when the gunfire started, and you didn't argue when I gave orders that made no sense to you at the time. Those are things that matter more than 2 weeks of bad jokes, Corporal Dawson. Dawson exhaled a long, shaky breath, something in his shoulders loosening for the first time since the canyon. I'm still sorry. for all of it. I know, Emily said simply. That's enough. Across the mess hall, Mitchell sat alone picking at food he had no appetite for, his mind still turning over every interaction of the last 2 weeks with a fresh, uncomfortable clarity. Reyes limped over on crutches and lowered himself carefully into the seat beside him. You look like a man who hasn't slept. I keep replaying it, Mitchell admitted. The bucket of water, the scrub brush, all of it. I keep thinking about how close we came to treating her badly enough that she just left, requested reassignment, and we'd have never known what we lost. But she didn't leave. No, she didn't. Mitchell shook his head slowly. I don't understand why. I wouldn't have stayed, not after being treated the way we treated her. Reyes considered this for a moment, his young face uncharacteristically thoughtful. Maybe she's used to it. Maybe this is just what it looks like every time she walks into somewhere new. People judging her before they know a single real thing about her, and she just absorbs it, waits it out until the truth shows itself on its own. He paused. That's a lonely way to live if you think about it. Mitchell hadn't thought about it that way, and the realization sat heavy in his chest. You're right. That is lonely. Yeah. Reyes glanced across the mess hall toward the table where Emily sat with Dawson, her posture still carrying that same careful, contained stillness, even now, even after everything. I don't think she expects an apology to fix that, Sarge. I think the only thing that actually matters to her is whether people change because of it. The following morning, the base received unwelcome confirmation that the previous day's events were far from finished. Colonel Hayes called Emily and Brooks into his office before sunrise, his expression grim, a secure phone still resting in its cradle from a call that had clearly not gone well. Division wants a full, formal inquiry, he said without preamble. Not into the rescue itself. Nobody's questioning that 4 Marines are alive because of what happened in that canyon. They want an inquiry into how a covert operative with an unregistered specialized equipment kit ended up embedded in a routine training exercise without proper notification through command channels. Emily's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sir, my assignment here was authorized at a level that doesn't typically loop in base command on operational specifics. That's by design, not oversight. I understand that, Captain. Division doesn't care. Division cares about liability, about protocol, about a training exercise that turned into an armed engagement with live casualties, and a classified operator nobody on this base was briefed to expect. Hayes rubbed his temples, clearly exhausted from a night spent fielding calls he'd never anticipated having to make. They're sending an investigator. 2 days from now. Full review of the engagement, your conduct, and Captain, I'm sorry to say this, but it's coming a review of whether your presence here was authorized through proper channels at all. The words landed heavier than anything that had happened in the canyon, because this wasn't a threat Emily could outmaneuver with speed or precision or the particular instincts that had kept her alive in far more dangerous places than a desert training range. This was bureaucracy, cold and slow-moving, and entirely indifferent to the fact that 4 Marines were alive because of what she'd done. Sir, Brooks said, stepping forward, unable to keep the frustration out of his voice. With respect, this feels like Division is more concerned about paperwork than the fact that Captain Carter single-handedly prevented a mass casualty event. I know how it feels, Master Sergeant. I feel it too. But I don't run this base in isolation, and neither of us can wave away an investigation once it's already been ordered from above. Hayes looked at Emily directly, something apologetic in his expression, despite the formality of his words. I'll do everything within my authority to make sure this process is fair, Captain. But I need you to understand the position we're in. Whatever protections your handlers have built around your identity, they're about to be tested by people who don't particularly care about protecting anyone but their own liability. Emily absorbed this in silence, her expression carefully neutral, though something behind her eyes carried the particular weariness of someone who had weathered this exact kind of institutional suspicion more times than she cared to count. Understood, sir, she said finally. I'll cooperate fully with the investigation. I know you will. That's not what worries me. Hayes's voice softened just slightly. What worries me is what happens to you if the investigation decides your presence here, however heroic the outcome, wasn't properly authorized in the first place. Word of the impending investigation moved through the base almost as quickly as news of the rescue had the day before, and by mid-afternoon a different kind of tension had settled over Fort Redstone. Not fear of external threats, but a growing protective anger among the Marines who had watched Emily save their lives, now confronted with the possibility that bureaucratic process might punish her for it. Sanchez, still recovering in the base infirmary with his arm in a sling, was the first to speak up when word reached him, his voice carrying down the ward loud enough for half the medical staff to hear. "They're investigating her for saving my life, for saving Torres's life. It's not about the rescue," a nurse tried to explain. "It's about protocol unauthorized." "I don't care what it's about." Sanchez struggled upright despite the nurse's protests. "If anybody from Division comes through that door asking questions, they're going to hear exactly what happened out there from every single one of us who was pinned down in that wash. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask for authorization. She acted, and because she acted, we're all alive to complain about paperwork. Instead of dead in a canyon, nobody would have found us in for hours." Word of Sanchez's outburst reached Mitchell within the hour, and something in him solidified into a decision he hadn't fully realized he'd already made. He found Dawson and Reyes near the barracks, both of them already having heard the same news, both wearing the same grim, determined expression he suspected was mirrored on his own face. "They can't seriously be considering punishing her," Dawson said, "after everything we watched her do." "They can, and they are," Mitchell said. "But they're going to have to go through every single Marine who was in that canyon to do it. I'm not letting some investigator from Division reduce what she did to a paperwork violation." Reyes nodded firmly. "What do? We tell the truth," Mitchell said. "All of it, every detail. We make sure whoever's running this investigation understands exactly what kind of officer they're talking about and exactly what happens to men like us when officers like her show up and do their job without asking for permission first." 2 days later, the investigator arrived, a stern, unsmiling major named Corbin, dispatched from Division with a briefcase full of protocol manuals and an expression that suggested he'd already formed conclusions before setting foot on Fort Redstone soil. The interviews began early, conducted one at a time in a sterile side office adjacent to the command building, and word filtered back through the base by midday of exactly how each conversation had gone. Mitchell went first, and he didn't hold back. "Sergeant, I need you to walk me through the decision-making process that led to an unauthorized specialized operative independently engaging hostile combatants during what was supposed to be a routine training exercise," Corbin said, pen poised over a legal pad. "With respect, sir, the decision-making process was pretty simple. My squad was pinned. One Marine was already injured. A separate patrol was actively taking fire, and one of their people was bleeding out, and Captain Carter was the only person on that range with the skill set to do something about it before more of us got killed." Mitchell held the major's gaze steadily. "I didn't authorize her to act because she doesn't need my authorization to save lives, sir. She acted because that's what needed to happen, and every Marine who walked out of that canyon alive is walking proof it was the right call." "That's not really the question I asked, Sergeant. With respect, sir, I think it's the only question that actually matters." Dawson's interview went much the same way as did Reyes's, hobbling into the office on crutches to deliver with unwavering conviction an account that left no room for Corbin's clipped procedural questions to reduce Emily's actions to anything less than what they were. Sanchez wheeled in from the infirmary against medical advice because he'd insisted was perhaps the most direct of all. "You want to know if her methods were within regulation?" he said, staring the major down despite the sling immobilizing his arm. "I don't know regulation, sir. I know I had maybe 10 minutes left before Torres bled out in that wash, and Captain Carter bought us those 10 minutes without a second's hesitation, without complaint, and without a single thought for her own safety. If your investigation decides that's a violation worth punishing, then your investigation is asking the wrong question." By the time Emily's own interview began late that afternoon, Major Corbin's expression had shifted from stern skepticism into something more complicated. Not quite sympathy, but a grudging, reluctant recognition that he was dealing with something far more layered than a simple protocol violation. Emily sat across from him with the same calm composure she'd carried since stepping off that transport truck 2 weeks earlier, giving away nothing beyond what the moment required. "Captain Carter, I've spent the last day interviewing every Marine present during Tuesday's engagement, and I want to be direct with you. Every single one of them has defended your conduct without hesitation, several quite forcefully. They're good Marines, Major. I'd expect nothing less." "That may be, but my job isn't to evaluate morale, Captain. My job is to determine whether an unregistered operative with classified equipment operating outside standard chain of command, represents a liability risk to this installation and to the Marine Corps at large. I understand your job, Major. Corbin studied her for a long moment, setting down his pen. Off the record, Captain, and I mean that this stays between us. I've read enough classified after-action reports in my career to recognize certain patterns when I see them. The precision, the equipment configuration, the way 6 trained Marines describe your actions with something closer to reverence than professional assessment. He leaned forward slightly. I don't need your operational designation confirmed to understand what I'm looking at across this table. I've heard rumors about an operator with your call sign for the better part of a decade. Most of us assumed it was exaggeration, storytelling, the kind of legend soldiers build to make the impossible feel survivable. Emily said nothing, her expression unchanged. I'm not going to ask you to confirm or deny anything you're not authorized to discuss, Corbin continued. But I will tell you this. Whatever conclusions my report ultimately reaches, they will reflect accurately what happened in that canyon and what I've heard from 6 Marines who owe you their lives. Division can decide what to do with that information. But I won't be the one who writes a report suggesting the woman who prevented a mass casualty event should be punished for it. For the first time since she'd arrived at Fort Redstone, something genuine flickered across Emily's carefully guarded expression, not surprise exactly, but something close to relief. Thank you, Major. Don't thank me yet, Captain. I still have questions about how your assignment here was authorized in the first place, and those answers matter for reasons beyond this base. Corbin's expression turned more serious. Off the record again, is there any indication this smuggling element had specific knowledge of your presence at Fort Redstone? Or was this genuinely, as initial assessment suggests, an unfortunate overlap of timing and terrain? Emily's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That's a question I've been asking myself since the moment the first shot was fired, Major. And your assessment, my assessment, is that I don't yet have enough information to rule it out completely. Her voice carried a new edge, something colder and more focused than the calm professionalism she'd maintained throughout the interview. Which is precisely why I'd like your investigation to prioritize identifying exactly who those 3 individuals were, who they were working for, and how they knew to be in that canyon on the exact day and hour this exercise was scheduled to run. Corbin's pen had stilled entirely, now his earlier procedural detachment giving way to something sharper. You think this was deliberate, targeted? I think it's a possibility I can't afford to dismiss, Major. And if I'm right, this investigation just became considerably more important than a protocol violation. The air in the small office shifted heavy with the weight of a question neither of them could yet answer. And somewhere beyond the walls of Fort Redstone, in whatever remained of the network that had put 3 armed men in that canyon on that exact day, an answer was already waiting to be found. One that would prove, before the week was over, that the danger following Emily Carter onto this base had never truly been about a training exercise gone wrong at all. Corbin's pen hovered above the legal pad, and for the first time since the interview began, the Major looked less like an investigator checking boxes and more like a man who understood he'd just stepped into something far larger than a training exercise gone wrong. Targeted, he repeated slowly. You have reason to believe this wasn't coincidence. I have a feeling, Major, and feelings are not evidence. But feelings have kept me alive longer than paperwork ever has. Emily's eyes had gone distant, calculating, running through possibilities she clearly didn't like. I need access to whatever intelligence was gathered on the 3 hostiles we detained. Names, affiliations, communications, if any, were recovered. That's an unusual request from someone under investigation. Then consider it a professional courtesy, Major, from one investigator to another. Because if I'm right, this stopped being about my conduct about 30 seconds ago, and it became about whether Fort Redstone has a much bigger problem than a captain with a thin personnel file. Corbin studied her for a long moment, weighing something behind his stern expression before finally closing his legal pad. Come with me. The holding facility sat at the far edge of the base, a squat concrete building normally used for nothing more dramatic than processing minor disciplinary cases. Today it held 3 men under armed guards separated into individual rooms, each one silent and uncooperative since the moment they'd been brought in. Emily stood outside the observation window of the first room, studying the man inside through the one-way glass, mid-30s, lean a tattoo along his forearm that meant nothing to Corbin, but made Emily's jaw tighten the instant she saw it. You recognize something, Corbin said, watching her reaction closely. Maybe. She didn't elaborate immediately, her eyes tracing the tattoo again, cross-referencing it against something buried deep in memory. Major, has anyone run facial recognition against this man yet? Preliminary scan came back inconclusive. No matches in the standard database. Try a different database. Cross-border trafficking networks operating out of the southern corridor, specifically anyone connected to a smuggling operation broken up about 3 years ago near the Sonoran crossing points. Corbin's eyebrows rose. You're being oddly specific for someone who claimed a feeling a minute ago. I was there when that operation got broken up, Major. I'm the reason it got broken up. Emily's voice had dropped quiet and hard, carrying a weight that made Corbin go very still. If this man is connected to what I think he's connected to, this wasn't a coincidence at all. It was retaliation, and it wasn't aimed at Fort Redstone. It was aimed at you. Emily didn't answer, but she didn't need to. The silence said enough. The confirmation came 4 hours later, delivered by a division intelligence officer patched in through secure video link, his face grainy on the small monitor set up in Corbin's temporary office. We got a hit, the officer said without preamble. The individual in holding cell 1 were calling him by an alias. For now, Ruiz has confirmed ties to a trafficking network that operated across the southern corridor until approximately 3 years ago, when the network's primary logistics hub was dismantled in a joint operation. Records on that operation are heavily classified, but the file references an unnamed asset who compromised the network's leadership and forced their operations underground for the better part of 2 years. Corbin glanced at Emily. She said nothing, her expression carved from stone. Recently, the officer continued, fragments of that network have been rebuilding smaller, more desperate, more willing to take reckless risks to re-establish old routes. Chatter intercepted over the last 6 weeks references a specific individual by call sign, someone the network apparently blames directly for the collapse of their operation 3 years ago. The chatter suggested they'd identified a possible location for this individual and were planning to, quote, settle an old account. The call sign? Fine, Emily said quietly. It wasn't a question. The intelligence officer hesitated, glancing at his own notes before answering. Iron Wolf. The room went utterly silent. Corbin sat back slowly in his chair, processing the full weight of what he'd just heard, the pieces of the last 3 days rearranging themselves into a picture far darker and far more deliberate than anything he'd walked onto this base expecting to find. They knew you were here, he said finally. They suspected, Emily corrected, though there was little comfort in the distinction. My assignment to Fort Redstone wasn't public. It shouldn't have been traceable, but smuggling networks with the right money and the right patience have ways of tracking movement that most conventional security measures don't account for. So this wasn't a random encounter in a canyon. No, Major, I don't think it was. Emily's voice had gone flat, controlled in the particular way people control themselves when they're holding something dangerous very carefully. I think 3 men crossed into a live training exercise on the exact day and hour it was scheduled to run because they were hunting for me specifically, and they were willing to risk engaging an entire United States Marine unit to do it. Word of the revelation didn't stay contained for long, not on a base as small and tightly wound as Fort Redstone. And by that evening, a different kind of unease had settled over the barracks. Not the awed, reverent whispers of the previous 2 days, but something colder. Mitchell found Brooks near the motor pool, staring out at the darkening horizon with an expression Mitchell had rarely seen on the older man's face. You heard, Mitchell said. I heard. Brooks didn't turn around. 3 years, and it finally caught up to her. Followed her halfway across the country to a base nobody outside the Corps had ever heard of. You think there's more of them out there? People still hunting her. Brooks was quiet for a long moment. I think a woman who dismantles trafficking networks for a living probably has more enemies than either of us wants to imagine. And I think today was a reminder that the quiet she's built for herself, the anonymity, it's the only real protection she has. And today it cracked. Mitchell absorbed that something protective and angry stirring in his chest that surprised him with its intensity. 2 weeks ago, he wouldn't have cared whether Emily Carter had a single enemy in the world. Now the thought of her being hunted, tracked, targeted specifically because of the good she'd done years earlier, made something in him want to stand between her and whatever was still out there. What happens now? He asked. Now, Brooks said, finally turning to face him. Division decides whether keeping her here puts this entire base at risk or whether pulling her out puts her somewhere even more exposed. Either way, Mitchell, I don't think Fort Redstone gets to just go back to normal after this. The next morning brought Emily back into Corbin's office, this time with Colonel Hayes present as well. The three of them gathered around a table now covered in intelligence summaries, threat assessments, and a decision that carried weight far beyond a single training exercise. The network's remaining leadership is fractured, disorganized, and now missing three of their people. The division intelligence officer explained via secure link. Our assessment is that the immediate threat has been neutralized, but we can't rule out the possibility of a second attempt, whether through this network's remaining assets or through information they may have already passed to other interested parties before this operation failed. Hayes rubbed his temples, the weight of command visible in every line of his face. So we don't actually know if Fort Redstone is safe. No installation is ever entirely safe, Colonel, but the specific threat that materialized here appears to have been eliminated along with the individuals detained yesterday. The officer's tone carried the careful hedging of someone unwilling to offer guarantees he couldn't back up. Recommend continued heightened security posture for the next 30 to 60 days as a precaution. Emily sat through the exchange with the same controlled stillness she'd carried since arriving, though something in her posture today felt different. Heavier, more exposed, as if the revelation of her own history had stripped away a layer of the careful anonymity she'd spent years building. Captain Carter, Hayes said, finally turning to her directly, Division wants to know your preference. Reassignment to a secure facility, effective immediately, or continued deployment here at Fort Redstone under enhanced protective measures. Every eye in the room turned toward her, waiting. Emily was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the detached professionalism she'd maintained throughout the entire ordeal. I'd like to stay, sir, long enough to see this properly closed out. These Marines walked into a live engagement because of a threat connected to my past, whether or not any of us understood that at the time. I owe them more than a quiet exit while Division sorts out where to hide me next. Hayes studied her, something like genuine respect settling into his expression. That's not a small request, Captain. Staying means accepting continued risk, however reduced. I've accepted worse odds for less reason, sir. Major Corbin's final report, delivered 3 days later, landed on Colonel Hayes' desk with a conclusion that surprised absolutely no one who had witnessed the Canyon engagement firsthand and satisfied even the most skeptical voices at Division headquarters. The report confirmed Captain Emily Carter's actions during the incident had directly prevented multiple Marine casualties, that her operational conduct, while unconventional by standard training protocols, fell squarely within the bounds of emergency response authority granted to specialized personnel in active threat scenarios, and that any procedural gaps in her assignment notification to base command stemmed from operational security requirements authorized at a level above Fort Redstone's jurisdiction, not from any failure of process on her part. More than that, buried in the report's closing pages, Corbin had included a personal note rarely found in formal military documentation, a recommendation that Captain Carter's conduct be considered for formal commendation, citing not only her tactical performance, but what he described as, in his own words, an unusual and admirable restraint in allowing her true capabilities to remain unknown for weeks, despite repeated disrespect from personnel who had no idea who they were dealing with. Hayes read that final paragraph twice before setting the report down and reaching for his phone. Get me Captain Carter, Vinny said, and Master Sergeant Brooks. I think there are a few things that need to be said properly in front of the whole base before this is over. The formation that gathered on the parade ground 3 days later was larger than any routine assembly Fort Redstone typically called word-having, spread that something significant was about to happen, though few beyond the command staff knew exactly what. Mitchell stood near the front, with his squad Reyes balanced carefully on a cane, now his ankle healing, but still tender, Dawson beside him, with none of the smug arrogance that had once defined him. Sanchez present as, well-armed, still in a sling, but standing at attention despite his injury, refusing to miss this for anything. Colonel Hayes stepped to the front of the formation, Emily standing beside him, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Fort Redstone, she wasn't standing at the back of anything, wasn't blending into anonymity, wasn't carrying the deliberate invisibility she'd worn like armor for 2 weeks. 3 weeks ago, Hayes began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled ranks. An officer arrived at this base, in this installation, myself included, made a series of assumptions about her that I am not proud of in hindsight. We saw a quiet demeanor and assumed weakness. We saw an unfamiliar face and assumed inexperience. We handed her the least demanding duties this base has to offer and told ourselves we were being efficient, when in truth we were simply failing to look past what was easiest to believe. He paused, letting the words settle over the formation. What none of us understood until circumstances forced the truth into the open was that we had assigned menial labor to one of the most capable operators this country has ever trained. A woman who, without hesitation, without complaint, and without ever once demanding the respect she was owed, chose instead to earn it through action when this base needed her most. Hayes turned to Emily. Captain Carter, on behalf of every Marine at Fort Redstone, and on behalf of the 4 lives you saved in that canyon, I owe you a formal apology for the way you were treated during your first 2 weeks here. It will not happen again, not on this base, not while I command it. Emily's expression remained composed, but something behind her eyes had softened the particular vulnerability of someone unused to public acknowledgement, allowing herself just this once to receive it. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly. "Though I'd ask that any lesson taken from this be less about me specifically and more about how easily any one of us can misjudge someone standing right in front of us." "Duly noted, Captain." Hayes turned back to the formation. "Sergeant Mitchell, front and center." Mitchell stepped forward, spine straight, and came to attention in front of the Colonel and Emily, both his heart hammering with an anxiety that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with the weight of what he was about to say in front of the entire base. "Sergeant Mitchell has requested the opportunity to address the formation," Hayes said. "Permission granted." Mitchell turned to face the assembled Marines, his eyes briefly finding Emily's, before he began. "3 weeks ago, I handed Captain Carter a bucket of dirty water and told her in front of this entire platoon to learn how things work around here." His voice carried clearly unflinching, despite the discomfort evident in every line of his posture. "I want every one of you to understand something. That wasn't leadership. That was arrogance dressed up as authority, and I let 2 weeks of assumptions blind me to what was standing right in front of me the entire time." He paused, glancing at Emily again before continuing. "Captain Carter saved 4 Marines' lives in that canyon without a moment's hesitation, including Marines who had personally disrespected her for 2 straight weeks. She did it not because she had something to prove, but because it was the right thing to do, and she'd apparently decided a long time ago that being right mattered more than being seen." Mitchell's voice thickened slightly. "I want this platoon, and I want this entire base to remember what that looks like. Because the next time any of us meet someone, we don't immediately understand someone who doesn't fit the picture we expect. I hope we remember Captain Carter, and I hope we choose to look a little closer before we decide we already know everything we need to know." The formation stood in absolute silence as Mitchell stepped back into line, and Emily, watching him with an expression that had finally completely lost its careful guardedness, and offered the smallest nod of acknowledgement. Not forgiveness exactly, because there had never truly been anything to forgive in her eyes but recognition. Recognition that a man had looked at his own failure honestly in front of everyone who mattered and chosen to grow from it rather than bury it. The formal ceremony that followed was brief but weighted with a significance that few present would forget. Hayes presented Emily with a commendation for exceptional service, the language carefully worded to honor her actions, without compromising the classified nature of her true assignment, and as the base commander read the citation aloud, every Marine present understood they were witnessing something rare. The public acknowledgement of a person who had spent years operating entirely in the shadows, finally, if only briefly, allowed to stand in the light. Afterward, as the formation broke and Marines dispersed back toward their duties, Reyes made his way over on his cane, moving carefully across the parade ground until he reached Emily's side. "Hey," he said, "been meaning to ask you something since that night on perimeter watch, and I figure now's as good a time as any." "Go ahead." "That thing you said about someone who isn't here anymore teaching you to move it like that." He hesitated, unsure if the question crossed a line even now. "You don't have to answer. I've thought about it a lot since then." Emily was quiet for a moment, her eyes drifting toward the horizon, towards something distant that had nothing to do with the desert stretching in front of them. "Someone I trained under a long time ago believed the best operators were the ones nobody ever suspected. She used to say the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone's already stopped watching." A small, sad smile crossed her face. "She's not around to see how right she was, but I've spent a lot of years trying to make sure her lessons didn't disappear with her. I'm sorry, Reyes said quietly. Don't be. She'd be glad to know it still mattered. Emily glanced at him, something warmer in her expression than he'd seen from her before. You ask good questions, Reyes. Most people don't even when they're curious. Most people are too afraid of the answer to actually ask. I almost didn't. But you did anyway. That matters more than you think. 2 nights later, in the quiet hours after most of the base had settled into sleep, Emily found herself walking the perimeter fence alone, the same stretch of ground where she'd first revealed even a fraction of herself to a nervous young private on watch duty weeks earlier. She wasn't surprised when Brooks found her there. Couldn't sleep either, he asked, echoing the exact question Mitchell had once asked her in a supply room that felt like a lifetime ago now. Old habit, she admitted. Hard to fully rest when you've spent years training your body to stay alert. Brooks fell into step beside her, the two of them walking in comfortable silence for a while before he finally spoke what had clearly been sitting on his mind since the debrief days earlier. Division's going to reassign you eventually, somewhere more secure, somewhere the network that tracked you here can't find as easily. Probably. You don't sound thrilled about it. Emily exhaled slowly, watching the desert stretch out dark and endless beyond the fence line. I've been reassigned more times than I can count, Brooks. New base, new cover, new set of strangers who look at me and see whatever they've decided to see before I've said a single word. It gets tiring if I'm honest. Building something, even something small, and then having to leave it behind before it has a chance to mean anything. This time was different. This time was different, she agreed quietly. These Marines earned something most people never get the chance to earn from me. Actual trust. Not the kind you demand with a title or a reputation, but the kind you build slowly, one small moment at a time, until suddenly you look up and realize you're not alone in a room full of strangers anymore. Brooks studied her for a long moment. 3 years ago in that canyon, I never got the chance to properly thank the person who saved my team. Just a call sign over a radio and then silence, and I spent years wondering if I'd ever get the chance to look that person in the eye and tell them what it meant. You've thanked me plenty, Brooks. Not enough. Not for what it actually meant. His voice thickened slightly, the discipline he usually wore like a second skin slipping just enough to let something more honest through. You gave me back 6 men that night, Emily. 6 men who went home to their families because you appeared out of the dark when nobody else could reach us. I've spent 3 years trying to figure out how to properly repay something like that, and I still haven't found the words. Emily stopped walking, turning to face him fully, something gentle and unguarded in her expression that few people ever had the privilege of seeing. You don't repay it, Brooks. You just carry it forward. Same as I do. Same as every one of these Marines will now, whether they fully realize it yet or not. Carry it forward, how? By remembering what it costs to misjudge someone. By choosing the next time a stranger walks onto this base looking unremarkable, ordinary, easy to dismiss, to wonder instead what they might actually be capable of before deciding they're nothing at all. She managed a tired, genuine smile. That's the only repayment I've ever wanted, Brooks. Not gratitude. Just better judgment passed forward, one person at a time. The morning of Emily's departure arrived exactly 1 week after the Canyon Engagement Division, finally settling on a reassignment that would carry her toward a new posting, new cover, new set of strangers who would in all likelihood underestimate her exactly as thoroughly as Fort Redstone once had. But this departure looked nothing like her arrival 3 weeks earlier. Where she'd once stepped off a transport truck to laughter and a bucket of dirty water, she now walked toward a waiting vehicle through a corridor of Marines who had gathered unprompted, unofficial, simply because word had spread that Captain Carter was leaving and nobody wanted her to walk out those gates without acknowledgement. Mitchell stood near the front of the gathered crowd, and as Emily approached, he stepped forward one final time. Captain, Sergeant, I know I already said my piece in front of the formation, but I wanted to say something else just between us. He extended his hand and Emily accepted it, her grip firm and steady. Thank you, not just for the canyon, for staying patient with all of us long enough to let the truth come out on its own. Most people wouldn't have had that kind of patience. Most people haven't needed it as often as I have, Sergeant. You learn to be patient when the alternative is exhausting yourself, trying to convince people of something they're not ready to see yet. Dawson stepped forward, next considerably more subdued than the smirking corporal who'd handed her a scrub brush weeks earlier. For what it's worth, Captain, I've been telling the new guys about you, about what happened. Figured it might save the next person who shows up here from the same mistake we made. That's a good instinct, Corporal. Hold on to it. Reyes came last, still leaning on his cane, his expression carrying a mixture of gratitude and something close to genuine sadness at watching her leave. You said the most dangerous person in a room is the one everyone stopped watching. I did. I don't think anyone's going to stop watching you again. Not after this. Emily managed a small wry smile. That's the trouble with being seen, Reyes. It's harder to disappear the next time. But maybe that's all right. Maybe some things are worth being seen for. She reached the vehicle equipment case in hand and paused one final time before climbing in, turning back to look at the base that had for 3 brief weeks tested her in ways few postings ever had and had ultimately given her something she rarely allowed herself to expect from strangers. Respect earned honestly one difficult day at a time. Master Sergeant Daniel Brooks watched the vehicle disappear down the access road, dust rising behind it in the pale morning light, and turned to find a cluster of younger Marines nearby. Several of them, new arrivals who'd only heard fragments of the story, secondhand curious about the woman everyone on base seemed to speak of with a strange mixture of reverence and quiet awe. Master Sergeant, one of them asked a young private barely out of basic training. Is it true what they're saying about the captain who was here, that she was some kind of legend? Brooks considered the question for a long moment, his eyes still fixed on the empty road where the dust had begun to settle. She wasn't a legend when she arrived, he said finally. She was just a quiet woman nobody bothered to really look at. That's the part people forget when they tell this story afterward. They remember the ending, the radio call, the rescue, but they forget she spent 2 weeks scrubbing boots and carrying water crates without a single word of complaint, letting an entire base underestimate her completely because she understood something most people never learn. What's that, Master Sergeant? Brooks turned to face the small group of young Marines, his expression carrying the weight of everything he'd witnessed over the past 3 weeks. The doubt, the disbelief, the slow unraveling of assumptions, and finally the quiet, devastating proof of exactly who Captain Emily Carter really was. Never judge a warrior by what you see when they arrive, he said. The most experienced people often walk in quietly. They don't need to announce what they're capable of because they already know the truth will reveal itself, eventually on its own terms, exactly when it matters most. The battlefield doesn't care about appearances, gentlemen. It only reveals who was actually prepared. He let that settle over them watching, understanding slowly take root in their young faces. The same understanding that had taken root across an entire base over the course of 3 unforgettable weeks. The woman who left this base 20 minutes ago wasn't just an operator, and she wasn't just a call sign whispered in old files. Brooks continued, she was proof of something every single person in this Corps needs to remember, whether we're 20 years old and fresh out of basic or 20 years into a career, and certain we've already seen in everything. Strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need a title or a reputation or a room full of people already convinced. It simply shows up quietly, patiently, and waits for the moment it's needed most. And when that moment comes, it answers without hesitation. He looked back toward the empty road one final time, the desert morning stretching wide and silent around them, carrying with it the memory of a woman who had walked into Fort Redstone as a stranger nobody wanted, and walked out as a name nobody would ever forget. They called her Iron Wolf, Brooks said quietly, not because she demanded it, because she earned it one impossible moment at a time, standing between danger and the people who needed protecting long after everyone else had already given up. He turned back to the young Marines, his voice firm and final. Remember that, every single one of you, because the next quiet stranger who walks through these gates might be carrying exactly the same kind of strength, and it's on us every time to look a little closer before we decide we already know who they are. The desert wind carried his words across the parade ground, past the barracks, past the equipment shed, where a scrub brush still sat forgotten in a corner, a small, ordinary object that had once been handed to an extraordinary woman as an insult and had instead become, in the end, a quiet testament to exactly how wrong first impressions could be. Because true strength never needed to announce itself. It only needed the chance to prove itself when it mattered most, and Emily Carter, known to the world only as Iron Wolf, had proven it beyond any doubt anyone at Fort Redstone would ever again dare to hold.